Hello, welcome back to our conference. For those just joining, this is the Schiller Institute conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. I'm Harley Schlanger and I'll moderate this, our third panel, which is on security. The just concluded panel on economics detailed the devastation done by demanding that nations adhere to the dictates of the neoliberal financial system, which benefit the speculative financiers of the City of London and Wall Street, and is defended by the military power of the United States and NATO. This system is presently threatened by an emerging realignment of nations, nations which do not accept the arbitrary rules demanded by the beneficiaries of the rules-based order. In this panel, speakers will discuss how we can organize a world in which the benefit of all peoples and all sovereign nations can live and progress in peaceful, mutually beneficial cooperation. Our first speaker will be Jacques Cheminade. Jacques is the president of Solidarité et Progrès in France, a former presidential candidate for France, and he'll be speaking on the Peace of Westphalia to escape the Thucydides trap. Jacques?
The Peace of Westphalia to escape the Thucydides trap. Beginning in 1618, the 30 Years' War claimed the lives of at least 5 million people. It was a true European apocalypse. Today, we are sitting on a doomsday machine. Our challenge is to stop it before it destroys mankind, either through a global economic devastation or nuclear war. The solution provided by the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 to the atrocities of its time should be an inspiration for us to create a dynamic of peace through change of our way of thinking and our way of doing. Because it not only ended religious wars and established a new form of peace negotiations among states, as you can read in all history books, but more fundamentally, because it addressed agape, the Greek word for understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all men in a secular sense. In his dialogue of Eurasian civilizations, Earth's next 50 years, LaRouche tells us, the implicit basis for knowledge of the competence of our choices lies not in the experience of the past, but on the competence of our experience of the future. The spirit of the Peace of Westphalia is a reference for us precisely for that reason. It relates to a concept of mankind that did not yet exist at that time, but which was nonetheless absolutely indispensable to conceive in order to bring to an end the mutual destruction occurring then within a lose-lose system. It is our challenge today, again, to see with the eyes of the future. To give you a sense of the atrocities of war, I show you here the hanging from a series of 18 engravings by Jacques Callot going back to 1633, called Miseries and Misfortunes of War, where he depicts how wartime violence and moral degradation concern civilians and soldiers alike. The sack of the city of Magdeburg is a terrible example of such atrocities. In one day, after the soldiers infiltrated the besieged city, only 200 of the 1,100 buildings remained undamaged, and around 4/5 of the city's 25,000 inhabitants were dead. It took then more than 4 years for negotiation between 1643 and 1648 to reach an agreement through various treaties, mainly in Münster and Osnabrück. Peace requires to generate international principles and laws between nation-states. It can never be a mere diplomatic arrangement within an existing system. How was it possible then? Because it did create a higher order of relations between nations and human beings. This is basically, again, why it shall be our reference today. On the opposite side, a vicious warmonger and global Britain addict like Tony Blair delivered a speech in Chicago in April 1999, repudiating Westphalia and upholding his conception of murderous liberal interventionism against nation-states. Let's then look carefully to the three main principles of Westphalia and how they lead to a win-win system of mutual development, which was then called cameralism, mercantilism, or Philadelphic. Article 1 states the core of the Westphalian philosophy, that there shall be a Christian and universal peace, that each party shall endeavor to procure the benefit, honor, and advantage of the other. It is absolutely contrary to the principle of geopolitics, according to which each player tries to take the benefit of all the games at the expense of the others. Article 2 outlines, there shall be on the one side and on the other a perpetual oblivion, amnesty and pardon of all that has been committed since the beginning of these troubles, in what place or what manner soever the hostilities have been practiced, in such a manner that nobody, under any pretext whatsoever, shall practice any acts of hostility and entertain any enmity or cause any trouble to each other. This is what it means to see with the eyes of the future, and not through the never-ending and self-destructive grievances of the past. Then the treaty, before settling territorial claims, concentrates on addressing the economic ruin in which all were descending. Identified as potential causes feeding the perpetual war dynamic, insolvent and illegitimate debt and financial claims are sorted out and settled, mostly by debt cancellation, Articles 13 and 35 to 39, or negotiated rescheduling, Article 48. Article 37 in particular states, contracts, exchanges, transactions, obligations, treaties made by constraints or threats and extorted illegally from states or subjects shall be so annulled and abolished that no more enquiry shall be made after them. Article 40 adds, and yet the sums of money which during the war have been extracted bona fide and by good intent, by way of contributions to prevent greater evils by the contributors, are not comprehended herein. It is the spirit of the Glass-Steagall Act against what Roosevelt called the money makers and banksters. Let me add something briefly. It is with the same spirit that Martin Luther King was embodied his spirit in his famous political sermon delivered at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Loving our enemies, inspired by Matthew's Gospel. He stressed, far from being the pious instruction of a utopian dreamer, this command is an absolute necessity for the survival of our civilization. And then he stressed, a second thing that an individual must do in seeking to love his enemies is to discover the element of good in his enemy. And every time you begin to hate that person and think of hating that person, realize that there is some good there and look at those good points which will overbalance the bad points. And then there is another reason why you should love your enemies, and that is because hate distorts the personality of the hater. What Martin expresses here, in its deepest form, is a principle shared by the best of all civilizations in our human history. When you are committed to improve a person by changing his or her way of thinking and acting, and therefore to improving yourself. Organizing the other in the spirit of the Peace of Westphalia is our challenge. Inspired by Nicholas of Cusa, you have heard Helga Zepp-LaRouche challenging us to reach a level of the coincidence of the opposites. To make peace is not to solve things with a friend, but to organize an enemy at a higher level of thinking and doing than the level on which the conflict arose, from where it becomes possible to share in doing the good together. This is precisely where the Peace of Westphalia leads to the blossoming of human creativity in the physical universe. Peace, to be maintained and developed, has to be based on an increasing human productivity associated to the discovery of new physical principles applied in the form of technologies, ensuring improving conceptions of social life for all. This was accomplished in both Germany and France under the contributions of the creative minds of the second part of the 17th century, in particular of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. In France, around the Académie des Sciences, it is known under the name of Colbertist mercantilist economics. In Germany, it generated cameralism, improvement of national government, simultaneously directed towards increasing the yields of agriculture, manufacturing, and social responsibility, long-term economic growth for the benefit of all. It is key to stress here that Leibniz, in his Novissima Sinica from 1697, developed the concept that the West and the East of the Eurasian continent should exchange the best of each, the commitment to science and technological development in the West, and the principles of harmonious social development in China. Some exchanges of high value for both took indeed place, but the project as an impulsion towards universal unity was blocked. Is it not precisely what has not been possible then that is our Westphalian challenge now? I'm happy that the purpose of our conference is precisely that, unity without uniformization, exchanging the best of all of us to secure peace through the common development of our human potentials in the universe, above and beyond what we know. Leibniz, in his Codex Jurius Gentium, wrote, "A good man is one that loves everybody, so far as reason permits. Charity is a universal benevolence, and benevolence a habit of loving or willing to love the good. Love then signifies rejoicing in the happiness of the other. The happiness of those whose happiness pleases us turns into our own happiness. Some would call it utopian. They are deadly wrong. Deadly, because the alternative today is to fall into the Thucydides trap, the geopolitical conception that a declining power is necessarily confronted by a rising one and that it means war. This is what ruined Sparta and Athens in the Peloponnese Wars. What threatens to ruin us now would be far worse, because this time it is at the level of all humanity equipped with destructive financial algorithms and nuclear weapons. Theirs is a culture of death. Ours is a culture of life, for the common good and the benefit of future generations." Just one word to conclude. Xi Jinping is a dedicated reader of Leibniz, and the web pages I Xiqiang, fond of thinking, is a platform for Chinese dedication to the future. What Europe has generated, including the Constitution of the United States, is the other reason why we are here. Let them be happy to be different, but with the same Westphalian thrust for unity to repair and rebuild our so immediately threatened world.
Thank you, Jacques. And Jacques will be joining us in the question and answer session immediately following this panel. And I hope we'll put up on the screen the address, the email address where you can send your questions. There it is. Now, the second presentation, and this is the third panel if you're just joining us, on the security architecture and how to achieve it in breaking with the existing war and financial disruption order which we are presently facing. Our next presentation will be by Diogenes Seni, who's the president of the Pan-African League Umoja Congo from the Republic of Congo. And his topic is What Africa Expects from the World.
Dear speakers, dear participants, dear guests, first let me thank the Schiller Institute for inviting me on behalf of our party, the Pan-African League, Umoja, Congo, and of the Coordination des Partis Politiques Panafricanistes, of which I am the president, to speak at this important international conference. I also thank all the speakers for the quality of their interventions delivered before my own intervention. The title of this conference is Establishing a New Security and Development Architecture for All Nations. And the theme I will address in this intervention is What can Africa expect from the rest of the world? Theme that we rephrase in the following way: Pan-Africanism and the geopolitics of war. The Russian-Ukrainian conflict, which is currently tearing Europe apart and on its eastern flank, is a real concern because of the immediate and direct human drama it generates, but also because of its indirect consequences at the economic level, well beyond the area of confrontation. However, like any geopolitical crisis, most often accompanied by wars, it is first and foremost a consequence of the geopolitical permanency of the West, a system which for the first time since the Middle Ages has experienced one of the longest periods of stability from 1945 to 2022, or 77 years. We tend to forget that at the end of the Second World War, the hypocrisy of the victors led them to condemn geopolitics, calling it a Nazi science, having provided Hitler with scientific and ideological justifications for his vital space, Lebensraum, his will to conquer and dominate. Even Stalin's Soviet Union had forbidden the teaching of geopolitics, calling it a cursed discipline of an evil Germany which was consubstantial with Nazism. However, if we look closely, apart from the racist ideological considerations of the German regime, the Second 30 Years' War between 1914 and 1945 is a result of the geopolitical rivalries of the European powers that go back to the past centuries and that have never ceased. Periodically, each European power tried to impose its hegemony on the others. We remember the Spain of Charles V and then of Philip II, the France of Louis XIV and then of Napoleon, the Germany of William II and then of Hitler, etc. Thus, each time a European power shows an excessive political appetite, the resistance of the others is organized in order to neutralize it. Consequently, each European power will build a geopolitics of both protection and conquest by seeking a vital space in Europe and outside if possible. This is the beginning of what is called steeplechase, that is to say, a transposition into Africa of European geopolitical conflicts in view of the conquest of Lebensraum and the sharing of Africa. Two types of European imperialist powers clashed over Africa. On the one hand, the old colonial powers such as Portugal, France, and England, and on the other, the young imperialists, Germany and Belgium. The Berlin Conference, 1885, under the leadership of Bismarck, in order to establish rules that would organize colonization, marked the first modern act of concerted and conscious exploitation of by the European powers, in spite of their age-old conflicts on the one hand, and the proclamations of human rights on the other. Divided into zones of influence of the European powers, Africa will not cease to serve from the end of the 19th century as a provider of natural and mineral resources, geopolitical ambitions to all Western powers. After the Second World War, the winning and reigning powers of the time, which had redrawn the contours of the new global power relations, only gave in formally to the demands of decolonization in the 1960s. For despite the accession of several African countries to international sovereignty, most of the political leaders who wished to give independence a real economic and cultural reality were dismissed or assassinated. The most emblematic case is the assassination of Patrice Emery Lumumba by a Belgian-American coalition in January 1961, as soon as the Democratic Republic of Congo gained independence on June 30, 1960. Lumumba opens a long list of African patriots victims of Western imperialism. Also, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, precisely at the end of the 1980s, the Western powers indicated that there was no longer any reason to support dictatorships in Africa, that it was time for democracy to prevail. Here again, African disillusionment is great. The zones of influence, despite minor changes, have remained connected to the geopolitics of each extra African power. Even the arrival of new emerging powers such as China does not change much. To sum it up, Africa, bogged down and fragmented into zones of influence and vital spaces, is the byproduct of the geopolitics of the Western imperialist powers, structured and organized since the 19th century. These Western geopolitics rely on a fringe of the African elite, baited by individual gain, who serve as a screen for the real masters. This is what's called neo-colonialism, which has never been as vivid as it is today, through a whole series of mechanisms, secret defense agreements justifying the presence of military bases, monetary controls such as the franc CFA, leonine trade agreements, the maintenance of outward-oriented economies, odious debts, etc. However, these zones of influence are spaces of organized chaos in which all kinds of villainous dictatorship abound. Consequently, this does not favor any viable development. For example, between the 1960s and the end of the 1980s, on the eve of the fall of the Berlin Wall, instability and chaos organized in Africa materialized in 71 successful military coups among 118 attempted coups d'etat. Since the return of multi-party politics, although military coups have decreased, we have nevertheless witnessed a new category of civilian coup, violation and manipulation of the constitution in order to retain state power, rigging of elections through the control of the commissions in charge of organizing elections, etc. To the question, what can Africa expect from the rest of the world? Africa expects the West to stop with its ambiguities and hypocrisy. In reality, Western geopolitical traditions have certainly mutated in many respects, but their structure remains the same. The geopolitics of the sea, England, United States, Japan, the continental geopolitics, Germany, the geopolitics of the fortress, in Russia, the geopolitics of defeat, France, Italy have undergone an aggiornamento with regard to the different revolutions that have taken place over time, but they need vital spaces in order to continue to maintain positions of power in the concert of nations. For without the double revolution of the atom and the missile, the Russia-Ukraine war would set the whole of Europe ablaze and drag the whole world with it, as the West knows how to do. That is why we reiterate this call for end to Western hypocrisy. The West must abandon geopolitics in order to get rid of harmful power complexes. Africans know that nobody will free them from this long servitude imposed by Western imperialism through African kingpins. The liberation of Africa will be the result of the insurrection of consciousness that is winning every day the African youth through Pan-Africanism. Because for us, peace in the world cannot be attained without reaffirming control and taking over the African zones of influence which feed the ambitions of the extra African powers. Pan-Africanism proposes to deprive any ambitious power of African resources in order to use them exclusively for the well-being of African populations. By creating the United States of Africa, Africa will no longer be a prey to extra African powers. By reuniting the African continent, Pan-Africanism allows Africans in all sovereignty to achieve their renaissance by rethinking the problem of borders in a peaceful and reconciled framework. However, in these worrying times, Pan-Africanism remains faithful to the spirit of Bandung, or Afro-Asianism, expressed in 1955, where in order to counter the axis of power from Washington to Moscow, another axis was traced from Accra to Jakarta, based on non-violence and non-alignment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diogenes. And he'll be with us in the question and answer session. If you have questions for the end of this panel, send them to the address you see on the screen right now. We intend to have hopefully 25 to 30 minutes for questions. Our next presentation will be from the United States, from Caleb Maupin, who's the founder and director of the Center for Political Innovation. And his topic today is the crisis facing U.S. society. Caleb?
Sure. I would like to thank the Schiller Institute for inviting me to join this very important web conference. I would like to thank Helga Zepp-LaRouche and all of the other speakers who have come together today. Many different perspectives and many different parts of the world represented here on this panel. So many important voices, and I'm really glad to be here representing the Center for Political Innovation today. The economic crisis facing the United States is very serious. And one thing that you will see that is greatly, heavily affecting working families throughout this country is the rising cost of fuel. If you go to a gas station anywhere in middle America, in Ohio, where I was born, in Pennsylvania, in Texas, in Alabama, in Colorado, you wait outside of a gas station, you'll see one thing. You'll see usually a mother with children in the backseat of the car, and she'll pull up to that gas station, and she will get out of her car, and she'll take the gas pump out, and she'll put very carefully just $10 worth of gasoline into her car. She won't fill up the tank. She'll just be very, very careful to stick the gas pump into the nozzle and just very carefully put $10 worth of gasoline into her car. Why is she doing that? You can't go very far on $10 worth of gasoline, but it's enough to get the kids to school. It's enough to get to the grocery store and buy food. It's enough to get to work for one more day. Working families across the United States are struggling. And Joe Biden seems to say this is our patriotic duty. We just have to endure this because this is the cost of being supportive of Ukraine and fighting against Russia. But there are millions of Americans who don't buy it, and millions of Americans who are sick and tired of seeing big banks and big oil companies and big Wall Street monopolists enrich themselves while the country gets poorer and poorer and poorer. But I want to contrast that example of what you're seeing all across America with what's going on in Eurasia. A few years ago, I had the ability in 2017 to go to the Sochi, in Sochi, Russia, there's what they call the Valdy Discussion Club. This is a think tank that's run by the Russian government. And I got to hear a number of key voices speak. And among those I heard at the Valdy Discussion Club was Aysel Toji of the Norwegian Nobel Institute. And in his remarks, Aysel Toji talked about how in Eurasia and in Russia and in China and in the Central Asian countries and in Pakistan, this is a golden era. High-speed railway is being laid. Access to electricity is being brought to remote regions. People are being lifted up from poverty. New opportunities are being created. Americans have been shielded and prevented from being aware of the huge amount of economic growth and opportunity and construction that is taking place in Eurasia. It has been just completely covered up, and people don't know about it. And I think part of the reason that U.S. media has worked so hard to conceal the economic miracles that are happening on the other side of the planet from us is because it's just common sense. When you see so much construction and so much growth, what the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, is doing, what Russia's doing with the Eurasian Economic Union, what's happening with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, when you see that, it's just common sense that as the economy in the United States is getting worse, that rather than having a hostile attitude toward Russia and a hostile attitude toward China, we should be cooperating with them. And if we want conditions in the United States to improve, we should start doing business with them. And we should start trying to figure out how we can get some of that growth to come over here and how we can cooperate and have joint ventures, how Russian companies and Chinese companies can team up with American companies to make life better in the heartland where our roads are crumbling and where the water treatment facilities are falling apart, where the power plants are in shambles. It would just be common sense to have Russia, China, and the United States working together to build a whole new country. Now, I'm coming here as a representative of the Center for Political Innovation, and I want to let you know about the Center for Political Innovation. We are a think tank. We are not a new political party or a new political formation. We are simply an entity of people rooted in socialist and Marxist and historical and dialectical materialist worldviews that are trying to develop policy solutions and carry out political education in the United States. And we begin each of our conferences with the following pledge. We pledge that we shall remember this unity, forged at the end of the Second World War, not only today, not only this week, this year, but always. Until we have built the world we have dreamed of and fought for, we pledge ourselves to build the unity of the people of the world, all races, all colors, all nationalities, all beliefs, to eliminate all traces of fascism from the earth, to build a deep and sincere international friendship among the people of the world, to keep a just, lasting peace, to eliminate want, frustration, and enforced idleness. We have come to confirm the unity of all people, to salute our comrades who have died, and to pledge our word that skillful hands, keen brains, and bold enthusiasm shall never more be wasted in war. And that is the CPI, the Center for Political Innovation Pledge of Unity. And we got it, we adjusted it, adapted it from the pledge of the World Democratic Youth Federation. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the Soviet Union convened the World Democratic Youth Federation and brought together young people from all across the planet to come together and pledge to build peace in the world, to oppose fascism, to oppose imperialism and war, to fight for economic development. And that is a form of left-wing politics that has been largely obscured. At the Center for Political Innovation, we do a lot to talk about Henry Wallace and his great presidential campaign in 1948, standing against McCarthyism. We talk about William Z. Foster and his optimistic vision of the new Europe coming out of the Second World War and the hope that countries could come together. We talk about the heroism of those who stood up against McCarthyism, ideas they cannot jail, Eugene Dennis and others. And this is a kind of socialist politics that's largely missing from U.S. political discourse. Leftism in the United States has become tainted with pessimism, hopelessness, destruction, culture wars, and vengeful politics. One example is there's a socialist group in the United States that claims to be a Maoist organization, that claims to support the Chinese Communist Party. They're called the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. And while the country is facing the economic crisis that's devastating Middle America, and while we have this danger of war on the horizon, what are they focusing on? Well, their activism right now is focused on trying to get Republicans banned from student governments in universities in Texas. They are focused on trying to purge Republicans from student governments. This is a ridiculous distortion of the politics of so many heroic individuals like Eugene Debs and Gus Hall, those who laid the basis with the Civil Rights Congress, Paul Robeson, William L. Patterson, and so many others. This destructive cancel culture leftism is a complete distortion of what so many people who believed in socialism, believed in Marxism, and had an optimistic output stood for. And it's in that light that I want to thank the Schiller Institute for convening great conferences like this. I want to thank the LaRouche organization for what they have done. And even though we have a different worldview, we're coming at things from a different perspective, I must say that your organization has been a great source of inspiration. I actually wanted to hold this up. I was very, very excited when I got my copy of the collected works of Lyndon LaRouche. I was very excited to get my hands on it, but I was a little bit disappointed because when I opened the table of contents, I discovered that I already had owned every book and every text that was reprinted in it. And you can be sure that the experience of the Schiller Institute and of the LaRouche organization and the history of the National Caucus of Labor Committees and the organizing that was done in times past and continues to go on by the Schiller Institute and by the LaRouche organization is definitely a source of inspiration for the work that we are doing. We are definitely learning from so much of the great work that has been done by your organization over the years, and we appreciate the ability to cooperate on things we agree on, like rebuilding the country with infrastructure, like building understanding and international friendship and cooperation with Russia and China, like opposing the drive for war and political repression. And I really am hopeful that despite all the pessimism and despite all the distortions we're currently seeing in U.S. politics, that something optimistic can break through. There are many people in the United States who don't buy what Joe Biden is saying, don't buy the degrowth agenda that speaks in the name of socialism and leftism, and instead would like to challenge the powers that be and fight for economic growth and construction in this age of darkness and pessimism, and look to Eurasia for inspiration. There was a friend of mine who was a German anti-imperialist activist, and he told me about how back in the 1980s, he used to see campaign posters for organizations aligned with Lyndon LaRouche and with the Schiller Institute in Germany. And they would have images of railway and trains across Russia and China going into Europe. And they looked at these posters and they thought, this is crazy science fiction. This is delusional. And now he looked back on that and realizes just how right and how much of a visionary Lyndon LaRouche was. That he really did understand the way the world was moving. In one of his books, I believe it's Earth's Next 50 Years, he talked about the Eurasian future for the planet, and that there was a huge amount of deep understanding of how the world works, of what motivates people, and where the world is going in the writing of Lyndon LaRouche, and there's plenty that can be learned from it. And it's very clear that the reason Lyndon LaRouche was put in jail was not for any crime he committed, but because he stood up to the forces of destruction and pessimism. And that's why he was put in prison. Exonerating Lyndon LaRouche and making clear he was not guilty of the crimes of which he was convicted is something that should happen. All political prisoners should be freed in the United States. And instead of jailing political activists, and instead of keeping political activists from the Black Liberation Movement or the Native American struggle like Leonard Peltier and others in jail, we should begin investigating the crimes of American intelligence agencies and the crimes of the FBI and the COINTELPRO program, what they've done to progressives throughout U.S. history. So I want to just end by saying, and going back to what I started with, that image of those children in the back seat of the car where the mother's filling up the gas tank with just $10 worth of gas. And I want to remind people that that's who we're fighting for. We fight for the millions, not the millionaires. We fight for a United States where working families can have justice and can be seen as an asset, and all people are given a place in an economy that marches ahead and builds a whole new world. We're fighting for a society where human beings aren't viewed as animals or economic calculations, but rather as creatures with great creative potential to build a new world and to create great discoveries and innovations. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this invitation, and I look forward to the discussion at the conclusion of hearing from the other speakers.
Well, thank you very much for that, Caleb. And you'll be with us for the discussion period. So if people have questions, again, send them to the banner that you see on the bottom of the screen. Now, our next speaker is Mike Callicrate. He's a cattleman from Kansas. He's the policy advocate and founder and owner of Ranch Foods Direct. And his topic today is "The Cartel Era Is Over, More Sovereign Farmers, Food for All, Double World Food Production." Mike?
Hello, this is Mike Callicrate from Colorado Springs, Colorado. I want to thank the Schiller Institute and Helga for this opportunity today to present on this panel. I think we need to look at the possibilities that are available to us in addressing this highly concentrated, globalized food system that is leaving a whole lot of people hungry in the world, and farmers, ranchers, and food producers included. So at Ranch Foods Direct, where I spend my time every day, along with Callicrate Cattle Company in St. Francis, Kansas, we have been working on building a more resilient and sustainable food system for about 22 years. But I think it's important to talk about why we have looked at this building of an alternative food system. And so we've always believed that concentration of power and wealth was one of the greatest threats to human civilization throughout history. And President James Madison said, "Concentrated wealth will destroy our nation unless the laws change. The day will come when our republic will be an impossibility because wealth will be concentrated in the hands of a few. When that day comes, we must rely upon the wisdom of the best elements in the country to readjust the laws of the nation." And I think that is where we are today. The United States Department of Agriculture has inscribed in stone above the main portico of the building, built in, the USDA was formed in the 1860s under President Lincoln. But inscribed in stone is the quote, "The husbandman that laboreth must be the first partaker of the fruits," St. Paul. Well, just the opposite today is occurring. The husbandman, the farmer, the steward of the land, is the last to receive any kind of return from the fruits of his labor. In fact, is being put out of business by this cartel-controlled food system. We're in the dereg business, said President Reagan. Government is the problem. What President Reagan did to antitrust law enforcement in the 80s was the equivalent of referees declaring no rules and leaving the field in a football game. Cheating was not only allowed, it was required and still is. In 1996, U.S. News and World Report did an article called "Illegal in Iowa." So 90 years after the Jungle, the book 1906 Jungle by Upton Sinclair, here we are again addressing the same problems. Even though laws were passed to prevent this sort of thing happening again, they haven't been enforced. 90 years after Upton Sinclair published this groundbreaking expose of the nation's meatpacking industry, illegal immigrants are flocking to the United States to take the dangerous, low-paying jobs most Americans won't. The difference between now and then, now there's a system that keeps the illegals coming and the industry humming, and the plants have come to rely on it. Bob Peterson, 1996, said, "There is no stopping it, concentration. This is an evolution that's going to take place in spite of whoever is in the way." This coming from the largest meat packer in the world, Iowa Beef Processors, soon to be owned by Tyson Foods. In 1998, December 1998, I was told by my only buyer, National Beef at St. Francis, Kansas, that they would no longer be buying my cattle. I had 14,000 cattle in a 12,000 head feedlot because I couldn't sell them. And so I called Secretary Dan Glickman, whose responsibility it was to enforce the Packers and Stockyards Act, which would have prevented me from being blackballed by the Packers. And I asked him why he didn't enforce the law. And he says, "Well, you know, Mike, in this modern day of globalization, we need big companies that can do business globally." A judge in the court case that I was part of, a plaintiff in, that was filed in 1996, which led to my being blackballed by the big Packers. A captured judiciary reverses the intent of the 1921 Packers and Stockyards Act to protect producers from abusive meatpacking power. Judge Strom set very bad precedent when he reversed that 2004 jury decision and award, finding Tyson IBP in violation of the Packers and Stockyards Act. And the Supreme Court later refused to hear the case. So Judge Strom took away from the plaintiffs, the cattleman plaintiffs in the case, a $1.28 billion jury award and any hope of injunctive relief, stopping the meat packers from acting anti-competitively. JBS gives top job to senior U.S. politician, Sao Paulo, Brazil, former U.S. Rep. John Boehner, the 53rd Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, was appointed to the board of JBS Foods International, a subsidiary of Sao Paulo, Brazil-based JBS. So here we have more of the revolving door from government to corporation and back again. John Boehner was important in repealing the country of origin labeling law, as well as reversing much of the intent of the price reporting law that was supposed to protect producers and make the markets more transparent. So business as usual at JBS. After paying $3 billion to settle bribery charges and corruption charges, the Batistas are still in the driver's seat at JBS. August 2017. Also in 2017, JBS hires the former USDA food safety chief, Al Almanza. Al Almanza had been working at USDA for nearly 40 years and had been instrumental in putting small plants out of business with onerous regulations and rules like HACCP. And then, as administrator of USDA, allowed the rotten meat in from Brazil during an 80-day period, which every other country had blocked that meat from entering their or crossing their borders. Al Almanza goes to work for JBS. The monopoly that's standing between farmers and ranchers and consumers and controlling the costs of inputs and the prices of outputs is the major threat to farmers and ranchers and consumers as well in having access to good food. The monopoly is extracting the wealth from this enterprise called agriculture, leaving poverty behind, hungry people, bad food, highly processed foods, and deepening the world's crisis of hunger and lack of food. 4 big meat packers are crushing small ranchers. The JBS cyber attack was only a hiccup in the meat packing operations, but for legislators, the security scare was a sign that it might be time to break up the industry. Again, much like the COVID problem, and the breakdown of the supply chain, we are looking to build better, more resilient, safer food systems that will lift people from poverty, not only in agriculture, but people who eat as well. Monopolies are bad. It's been written about by several authors, and Barry Lynn says, fight what's bad while building something better. So let's build something better. What will that look like? Abraham Lincoln and his advisor, Henry Carey, said, we must adopt measures needed for bringing together the producers and consumers of food and wool, and thus augmenting their power to have commerce among themselves. What's that look like? Big food is standing between eaters on one hand and farmers and ranchers on the other. Let's build a system that goes around the big food monopoly cartel. And we've done that with Ranch Foods Direct. And we support the family farm and ranch. We believe the ideal farm is family owned and operated, diversified, livestock centered, responsibly grazing and feeding the farm's production with animal manure going back to the land. A more direct route for producers to connect with consumers wanting to know where their food comes from might be a mobile slaughter unit placed at a livestock operation. Animals are processed where they are, eliminating the stress of transport and improving meat quality by also reducing stress and cost. In 1921, the mobile slaughter unit moved to Montana to be part of a teaching curriculum at Northern Montana College and is now replaced with a purpose-built slaughter floor at St. Francis, Kansas. Carcasses travel 200 miles to Colorado Springs, along with eggs and other food items from the region, and delivered to the Colorado Springs Food Hub, which is the home of Ranch Foods Direct. The final step, in my view, to really restore some well-being back to agriculture, as well as giving consumers better food, keeping money in communities instead of being extracted to global corporations and wealthy elites around the world. I think we build public markets, whether they're publicly owned or privately owned or co-owned by the vendors that are in them. And in my description of the market, the market feeds the city. Owner-operated businesses process and package foods from the region, from meats to grains to seasonal produce. A brewery using local grains and hops, along with many other prepared food makers, sell directly to eaters and eateries. Seasonal markets outflow from the main market, welcoming producers and growers from urban to rural. The energy-filled year-round market is where community happens, a gathering place for residents and visitors. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And now we're going to go to the question and answer session. Let me begin by reminding you this is the third session, the third panel of the Schiller Institute Conference on establishing a new security and development architecture for all nations. Now, we've received many, many more questions than we can get to, and I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all your questions, but I thank people for the passion that went into these questions. And let's start with one for anyone on the panel. Someone wrote, given the obvious unwillingness of the US and NATO to even consider President Putin's reasonable insistence on security guarantees, and the enmity shown toward Russia with the sanctions regime, what change would make forgiveness possible to reach a Westphalian peace? Why don't we start with you, Jacques?
Well, I think both in domestic policies and international policies, there is a wrong sense of what security means. Security is not only to protect against eventual enemies. Security is both social, to be fed and to be taken care properly of your health. Security is economic security, the capacity to develop your society to higher forms of production. It's education, and it's also, of course, public health. This is our Sina project. So this sense of security as a whole justice done to the creative powers of the human being should be again put forward. And this is what our conference is doing, I think. It explains that if you need security, it can only be secured by development and by mutual development. And I think that's the key of the period to come. And for that, you must feel in yourself the right forms, the right emotions. When you see, as it was said before, millions, probably 1 billion people threatening to die, either by hunger or by cold, by inadequate cure or so, or other reasons. When you see that, if you are not moved, there is something wrong with you. And why is there then something wrong? And this is connected to what Caleb Moppins just said. It's a distortion of emotions. To do the right thing and to act according to a human behavior, you should feel in yourself the right emotions leading you to discover, to create, to do things that would improve the state of your society and of the world. If you are fed with the wrong emotions, then you start to be destroyed and you can't act as you should have acted. It remembers me a discussion with Amelia Robinson many, many years ago. And she was saying, together with me, we were discussing the issue that people have been freed from slavery. Apparently, the bodies have been freed from slavery, but the minds have not been freed from slavery. And our task through a culture related to Westphalia, related to Bandung, related to all moments of human beings met to do something better with themselves, should be to break with the slavery of the minds and inspire people to the spirit of Westphalia, which is not only advantage of the other, but forgetting the grievances and seeing the future that is necessary instead of looking at the past. And in the past, looking what was potentially and what bring a possibility for a better future. So if you are like that, and if you, in our behavior, you all the time stick to that, then the world can be changed.
Diogene or Caleb, do you want to comment on that question? Well, let me move. I'm going to bundle two together because we're somewhat short on time. But someone wrote, why is no action being taken to address the danger of 1 billion people starving to death due to sanctions from the United States? And a second question along those same lines, how can an ordinary person contribute to establishing a new security order? Caleb, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, as far as the second question, how can an ordinary person contribute to establishing a new security order? At this point, it is very important that every person learn to challenge the lies that we are being spoon-fed. You know, every day coming out of our cell phones, there is just a wave of anti-Russian propaganda. It's coming at us from Twitter. It's coming at us from Facebook. It's coming at us from our televisions and from our laptops. And the only thing that many of us have is our own voice. And many of us know that these biolabs that US media pretends don't exist are in fact real. And Victoria Nuland acknowledged them on the floor of Congress. Well, we have a responsibility to step into the uncomfortable situation and tell our coworkers about those biolabs. We have a responsibility if we go to university to raise our hand in class and tell our classmates about those biolabs. And when we hear Russia accused of these crimes that now it's very apparent they haven't committed, like, you know, this allegation about the Bucha massacre and other allegations that have been thrown at Russia, we have a responsibility to use our individual power as a person to stand against the grain. The greatest heroes throughout history are not people who just went along with how things were going. You look at Joan of Arc, you look at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., these are people that took unpopular stands and said things that were quite cancelable, but they knew they were true, and they knew that the world was going in a dangerous direction, and they stood up and said things that were not popular. And that's what we need people to do. We need people to take a stand and become heroic and not be afraid to say that the Azov battalion, this division of the Ukrainian military that is made up of actual Nazis, is not worth the support of the American people. and that not one single American life should be sacrificed. Not one single American should be sent to die in Ukraine to prop up a regime that tears down World War II memorials, impoverishes its people, and is working with the Pentagon on these mysterious biolabs that now we're being told they're trying to tell us they don't exist. People need to be heroic. Now, as far as the first question, that was about what hope is there. I think at the end of the day, in the United States, there are a lot of small business owners. There's a lot of small farmers, like we just heard from here on the panel. There's a lot of people who own their own company. There's a lot of tech startups, and there's a lot of people who want economic growth. And they're seeing how the big monopolies, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the DuPonts, the Silicon Valley tech giants, the big banks, they have a strategy of keeping the economy wrecked as long as possible and securing their monopoly. And that strategy stands in opposition to what's going on in Russia and China. In Russia and China, they believe in economic growth. And, you know, Marxism has changed a lot since the Cold War. Deng Xiaoping said, poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious. There's an understanding that while it's important for the means of production, the banks, factories, and industries to be organized to serve the people and for there to be 5-year economic plans and economic development directed by a government that fights for working people, you still need a private sector. You need hotel owners. You need small farmers. You need restaurant chains. You need tech startups. And that an alliance between the members of the middle class and the small business owners who believe in growth and the working class and the labor movement who don't appreciate what Jeff Bezos is doing and how he's treating his workers, that's the way forward. And that it is the big monopolists, the huge corporations, the banks, the oil giants that are trying to roll back human progress. They are the enemy of all humanity. And it is ultimately in the economic interest of all working people, whether they work for wages or whether they own a small business, it is in their economic interest to see the artificial restraints imposed on society by the irrational rule of profits rolled back. And so kind of a new alignment based on understanding that economic growth is necessary, based on understanding that war is not in the interests of the world, and World War III would be a nightmare. A new kind of alignment is necessary, I would say. And small business owners, farmers, they have an important role to play in it. China would not have built itself up the way it has over the past 20 years without an alliance with a lot of Chinese small business owners who worked with the Chinese Communist Party to ensure economic growth. Growth is the way to a more egalitarian and prosperous society. If you don't believe in growth, you're not progressive.
Diogene, let me ask you a question from your experience in organizing in Africa. What do you think is the role of the individual in accomplishing what you're trying to do with Pan-Africanism? How do you organize people to become involved?
Bon, merci beaucoup.
Thank
En
you.
Afrique, la situation est un peu plus compliquée parce que, comme je disais dans mon intervention, nous sommes un peu les sous-produits des grandes géopolitiques. Nous sommes des zones d'influence. La réaction des États africains par rapport aux sanctions qui ont été imposées à la Russie est une réaction nouvelle. Elle résulte d'une... Oui.
Okay, can you hear
We
me?
need to have a translator. Go ahead.
Can you hear me, Harley?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, he's saying, well, we in Africa, we're somehow the byproducts. I mean, we're in the suburbs of the geopolitical European old colonial system, but everything which is going on there has side effects on what's happening in our regions.
Voilà, donc cette réaction des États africains n'est pas une réaction banale, c'est une réaction qui tient compte aujourd'hui d'un état d'esprit général, d'une jeunesse qui de plus en plus est au courant des enjeux. Il y a encore quelques années, même lorsque on bombardait la Libye, beaucoup d'États africains n'avaient pas osé protester. Il se trouve que sur ce qui se passe en Ukraine, le non-alignement en quelque sorte des États africains résulte d'une situation de société civile de plus en plus au fait des enjeux géopolitiques. Et nous, dans le cadre du panafricanisme,
so he's saying the fact that because on the last vote, many African countries abstained and were refusing to take sides and were completely into the non-alignment. He said this is happening because through the modern technology, including internet, and especially since the Libya intervention, there's a very big awareness in the civil society in Africa about what's really going on, and they don't want to be taken hostage into this situation.
Oui, donc ça nous favorise un peu le travail dans le cadre du panafricanisme, puisque le panafricanisme est une idéologie qui a connu beaucoup de répression. Dans le texte que j'ai fait, je parlais de Patrice Lumumba, qui a été le déclencheur des assassinats multiples et variés depuis les années 60, les années des indépendances. Cela s'est poursuivi et donc le panafricanisme a été plus ou moins enfermé et aujourd'hui, il y a une sorte de découverte de la part de la jeunesse de cette idéologie.
D'accord. So he's saying this new situation of information in civil society somehow makes our job easier, but he said the Pan-African ideology and ideas which we are promoting in the Umoja, we have been subjected to very much repression. The most known case is what happened with Patrice Lumumba, who was assassinated, and then many other people in this current, which were they suffered a lot of persecution, and finally they tried to put them in a box to isolate them, to prevent them from taking over by their ideas. But this now is falling apart, and there is a new generation of young Africans which are completely open to this new to the comeback of the Pan-African proposals.
Donc voilà globalement comment nous essayons de tirer profit de cette situation, mais c'est le résultat des décennies de combat, de clarification, de prise de conscience, de prise de risque face à des gouvernements en général qui sont alignés sur l'Occident. Et donc voilà à peu près la situation dans laquelle nous nous trouvons. Et on essaye donc absolument de profiter de cette prise de conscience générale pour faire avancer la cause du panafricanisme dans le continent africain. En réalité, pour finir, le panafricanisme, c'est vraiment l'antidote de la géopolitique, parce que nous mettrons fin aux bases militaires, aux zones d'influence, pour qu'il y ait une sorte de géopolitique multipolaire, en quelque sorte, si je peux me permettre.
Because what's happening, this revolution which is in the war, which is going on, it's we have to honor it has been a long fight over decades to come where we are today. He said Pan-African ideology is really an antidote to geopolitics, because we will get rid of geopolitics, we will get rid of military bases, of zones and spheres of influence, and it will be a multilateral but not a geopolitical new order of non-alignment, which is coming and being built right now.
Well, thank you for that answer. Now, we're running short of time, so I have two questions that I'm going to pose, one to Jacques and one to Caleb. Try to keep your answers short so we can have a final summation. In light of what we just heard, Jacques, for you, someone wrote, how do we get rid of the corrupt, obsolete Western institutions? And a second part of that is, should institutions like the CIA and National Security Agency even exist if we want to establish true collaboration between nations? Jacques, that's for you.
Well, people should learn from what LaRouche did during all his life against all this, against the oligarchy and institutions of oligarchy. I would simply say that exonerating LaRouche is a matter of public security, of public safety, not only for the world, but for the minds of our fellow citizens in each of our countries. And that will be a good beginning to discuss these ideas like we are discussing, in fact, today, but to continue as a to pursuit of happiness in that sense.
Okay. Caleb, this one's for you. How can the patriotic left and the right work together to overcome the imperialist Anglo-American oligarchy and make possible the new architecture for the world?
I don't think it's a question of bringing people together on the basis of whether or not they are left or whether or not they are right. The unity that's needed should be based on the program, what you are for. And serious proposals need to be put forward about what we're for, not what we're against, not where we stand in cultural divides, but what we are in favor of, what solutions we believe in. When you look at the situation on the U.S. border, for example, the fact that there are so many people from Central America coming to the United States, there needs to be an emergency plan for economic development of that region. The Mexican government would be on board with that. The United States needs to be on board with that. Nicaragua would be on board with that. China would be happy to get involved. And we need some kind of emergency economic development to address the needs of the people in that region. And that would address the issue of mass migration and the refugee crisis on the border. So it should be approached as, are you for an emergency economic development corridor in the southwestern United States and in Central America, or are you against it? And the same for other policies, policy solutions, rebuilding the infrastructure of the United States, putting our oil and natural gas and natural resources under public ownership so that money goes into the public budget, not into the pockets of Wall Street corporations, setting up a national bank that could lend money and rebuild the infrastructure of the country. These are policy solutions, and we should approach people on the question, are you for this or are you against it? Not are you from a left perspective, are you from a right-wing perspective? That's not the way to approach things. And the more you get to know Americans, wherever you go in the United States, there's a feeling that the economy is in ruin. There's a feeling that a small group of rich people have the power. And there's also a feeling that our civil liberties are being stripped away. And that goes for right-wing Americans, for left-wing Americans, for Midwestern Americans, for Southern Americans, urban Americans, rural Americans. Everybody knows these things in their bones. They know that the country is transitioning to a low-wage police state and the economy is being demolished. So if we can present ourselves, all of us of different perspectives, as the force of opposition to that deadly transition, that deadly great reset, then we have a hope for changing things and winning over popular support.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to conclude with, I'm going to give each of you 2 minutes to give a summary. I'm sorry for the shortage of time, but we have one more panel to go tonight. Diogenes, let's start with you.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Ce que je pourrais dire comme conclusion, d'abord, je voudrais remercier tous les intervenants par cette conférence qui vient à point nommé, parce que nous avons un seul son de cloche très majoritaire sur les événements actuellement qui dominent le monde, et cela est très, très préjudiciable pour tout le monde. Il faut être très équilibré par rapport à l'information en ce moment qui domine le monde. Et nous, pour le continent africain, nous n'attendons que la possibilité d'avoir une gouvernance du monde à laquelle nous allons participer de façon franche et pleine. Mais nous avons quand même affaire à des systèmes, à des gouvernements qui ont préempté sur les indépendances africaines, sur la souveraineté africaine. Donc, de l'intérieur, nous menons ce combat. Nous savons que c'est à nous de nous libérer d'abord et avant tout. Mais notre place dans la gouvernance du monde est attendue parce que ça ne peut pas être autrement. Ce continent a tout donné au monde. Il ne peut pas être exclu des débats, du droit international. Or, aujourd'hui, à cause des zones d'influence, nous sommes complètement caporalisés par des géopolitiques qui ont d'autres intérêts. Et donc, par conséquent, ce sont les peuples africains qui sont victimes de ces politiques internationales. Donc, l'objectif du panafricanisme, c'est vraiment de songer d'abord aux droits des peuples africains, qu'ils aient la possibilité d'avoir de l'eau, de l'électricité, des infrastructures de qualité, et que la question des dettes odieuses qui les ont qui sont imposées à ces populations soient concrètement balayées, parce que ces dettes n'ont pas lieu d'être dans la mesure où la contrepartie réelle des infrastructures qui auraient dû avoir lieu sur le continent n'existe pas. Et donc, nous nous battons à la fois sur tous ces fronts, la question de la dette odieuse, des zones militaires, des bases militaires extérieures, étrangères qui sont sur le continent, et naturellement de la souveraineté du continent, et ce qui doit se faire par l'unité des peuples africains afin d'être en situation de participer à un monde multipolaire.
Okay.
You have the translation?
Yes. Okay. So first, I want to thank all the people who organized and participated in this conference, which is coming really in the right moment, seeing the current events. Concerning the information which we're getting from the media, we have to remain very cautious. The African continent, we are only waiting to. We know that we will take part in the world governance, which our participation will be frank and full and entirely participating. We are fighting from the inside to free ourselves and to allow this continent, Africa, which gave so much to the world, to fully participate in world governance. Today, our continent is corporalisé. It's enlisted, used as an army by other powers. The people are victims. The basis of Pan-African thinking is the right of the people, which includes the right for energy, water, and healthcare. We will focus our fight against the odious debt. We have been enslaved by debt, which doesn't represent real investment in infrastructure or anything else. We're also opposing very strongly the military bases in Africa. And we want really to have a real sovereign continent which can fully participate in the new world which we are building together. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Diogenes. Caleb, 2 minutes.
Sure. Well, I live in Brooklyn. I'm talking to you from Brooklyn, New York. And really close to my house, there is a bridge that overlooks the tracks where the N train, the train I take to work every day, where that train runs. It's kind of, you got a bridge over the train tracks. And one day I was walking past that bridge, and I saw a father with 2 little children. And when the train came underneath the bridge, the kids were looking over the bridge, looking through little holes in the fence and the concrete wall and looking down at the train going on the tracks. And when they saw that train coming, they just jumped up and cheered and celebrated. They were so excited to see the train. And I'm thinking to myself, this is the same train that I see every day when I go to work. But in a way, those kids are right, because a train is a miracle. If you think about what human beings have done in just a few thousand years, we've gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to space travel and iPhones and high-speed railway. This shows the power of human beings. Ants have been building their ant farms the same way for thousands of years. Beavers have been building their beaver dams the same way for thousands of years. But there is something special about human beings. We are a species that is constantly reinventing the way we interact with our environment and is full of great potential. And it's that optimism that once filled the United States with hope. In better times, the time when the Second American Revolution was going on, when Abraham Lincoln was aligning with Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass to defeat the slaveholders, in the time of Roosevelt, when there was a Popular Front and labor activists and African American organizers were coming together to align the United States with the Soviet Union to defeat fascism, there was a belief in this kind of optimism and hope in the human spirit. And it's that kind of sentiment that we need to get back to. We need to get away from the pessimism, from the self-destruction, from the hopelessness that is pouring from all sides of U.S. society right now. We need to rekindle and we need to connect. That's the most important thing. This pandemic has led to people being isolated from each other, but building real activist communities where people are working together and people learn to be patient with each other. They learn to depend on each other. They learn to draw strength from each other and build off of each other's optimism, building real communities of solidarity. That is the hope for the way out of this. And that is the hope for getting the United States out of the crisis it's facing. That's the hope for getting the world onto a better footing. And I hope that I've been able to contribute to this discussion well and put forward that vision here. And I want to thank once again the folks from the Schiller Institute for convening this very, very important conference.
Well, thank you, Caleb, for your participation. Now I turn to my old friend Jacques for the final words of this panel. Jacques?
Well, let's put together an end, let's continue to put together an end to some things that we all feel is unbearable, including the abysmal present level of the French presidential elections, I must add. Let's fight with the eyes on the future for public credit, to rebuild public credit for development of a platform that has to be developed to make the world possible, because we are faced with something which is really like a death sentence for the world if it continues. So the danger of economic collapse or war. So to work, demand first to work on our own way of thinking, redesigning our own way of thinking and redesigning the world. Then politics get a sense, not what they are today, but politics have a sense. It's just politics, and it brings joy and happiness when you are involved in them. And I think today is the proof of it.
Thank you, Jacques, Caleb, Diogene, and also Mike Callicrate for your participation. This brings to a close our third panel, and we're now going to move into the fourth panel on development. And I'm going to turn you over to my esteemed colleague, Jason Ross, who will be in charge of this fourth panel. So Jason, take it away.
Thanks, Harley. So yes, this is the fourth panel of the Schiller Institute Conference on Establishing a New Security and Development Architecture for the World. I'm Jason Ross, the moderator for this panel, and the theme here is development. We will be hearing about initiatives of the Schiller Institute, in particular Operation Ibn Sina, which aims to create worldwide the infrastructure required for the provision of high-quality healthcare for every human being on this planet. To kick off our discussion, which will include speakers from the United States, Europe, Afghanistan, and South Africa, is Dennis Speed, part of the Schiller Institute's Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites and a longtime leader of the LaRouche movement. Dennis Speed's presentation is entitled The Urgent Need for a World Health System. Dennis.
2 years ago, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, founder of the Schiller Institute, and Dr. Jocelyn Elders, former Surgeon General of the United States, jointly proposed the need for a World Health Platform to not merely combat the coronavirus pandemic, but to address every aspect of the deepening world health crisis, including implicitly even the pathologies of racism and war. Now, others have, in their own ways, echoed this proposal. Most recently, President Xi Jinping of China proposed at the January 17th World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, that, quote, countries need to strengthen international cooperation against COVID-19, carry out active cooperation on research and development of medicines, jointly build multiple lines of defense against the coronavirus, and speed up efforts to build a global community of health for all. We should follow the trend of history, work for a stable international order, advocate common values of humanity, and build a community with a shared future for mankind. We should choose dialogue over confrontation, inclusiveness over exclusion, and stand against all forms of unilateralism, protectionism, hegemony, or power politics. In Lyndon LaRouche's 2001 essay, National Defense Against Germ Warfare, he states, national biological defense means chiefly those measures of sanitation which are essential to improving and defending the life expectancies and well-being of the population as a whole. This includes not only safe water, but also improved supplies of energy per capita and per square kilometer. It includes improved public transportation. The pivotal feature of the medical profession's role is the general hospital, provided as a public institution, which is not only a teaching institution, but which serves those sections of the population which are relatively indigent and are therefore the most likely radiators of infectious diseases. The public teaching hospital of this type, which is also integrated with the teaching and research functions of a university, is among the most valuable such facilities. As stated by Dr. Elders on November 23rd of last year in an open letter to virologists and medical experts around the world's healers must step up now to do the job that has not yet been done. We must educate the people so that science may supersede superstition, hope may conquer despair, and concern for all humanity overturns a self-destructive concern for just a select few of humanity. Dr. Elders also pointed out that the world has yet to adopt a unified educational and public information campaign to educate all of the world's people as to what we all must do now. Pandemics do not respond to election cycles, declarations of war, stock market fluctuations, or media campaigns. They respond to vigorous, competent, relentless public health measures in combination with medical breakthroughs required to address new situations. Now, this outlook, importantly, was the essence of the outlook that was imparted to a previous generation of American doctors through the work of none other than Martin Luther King, whose 1968 Poor People's Campaign had a far greater resonance than would have previously been noted. Dr. Elders, along with her colleague, Dr. David Satcher, both former Surgeons General of the United States, shared reflections about this with the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites.
I'm here in my office in Atlanta, which is on the campus of Morehouse School of Medicine. And I went to college here at Morehouse College, and in the early 1960s became involved in the student movement. And so that student movement did a lot to motivate me for my career in medicine, because I didn't come to school to go to jail, but many of us ended up in jail, some of us even in prison, not just for the sake of getting arrested or what have you, but because we believed that we had a responsibility to help to make the world a better place than it was. When I came to Atlanta, of course, there were stores downtown where we couldn't shop or couldn't work. So all of those things had to change. And I must say, I lived to see most of them change over a 4 to 5 year period here in Atlanta. Atlanta's a great place, but it had to overcome some real challenges in terms of how we view people and the rights of people. And I was very pleased to have been a small part of that. Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, didn't encourage us to go to jail, but he also didn't stop us from going to jail. I think he would have probably had to deal with our parents if he encouraged us to go to jail. But he certainly talked on Tuesday morning about the importance of standing up for your rights, about the power of resistance. And you can imagine the impact that that had on Martin Luther King Jr. more than 10 years before I became a student here. That was Benjamin Elijah Mays, a tremendous leader who said that that we can never take for granted the quality or the purpose of our lives. And we've got to continue to work to make sure that the lives of other people continue to get better.
Dr. Martin Luther King, famous statement, that a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And we should always make sure and say that this is health care denied to anyone, anywhere in the world, is a threat to the health care of everyone, everywhere in the world.
Helga Zepp-LaRouche's own outlook on this topic was put forth in a paper entitled Gandhi's Vision for a New Paradigm in International Relations, a New World Health System, and direct nonviolent action in times of social breakdown. This was presented to a meeting entitled Revisiting Gandhi, Peace, Justice, and Development, convened by the International Conference of the Association of Asian Scholars some 18 months ago. Martin Luther King's own work in the field of creative nonviolent direct action was significantly advanced through his trip to India in 1959. In 2009, 50 years later, All India Radio discovered a lost recording of King in which he said, "Many years ago when Abraham Lincoln was shot, and incidentally he was shot for the same reason that Mahatma Gandhi was shot, namely for committing the crime of wanting to heal the wounds of a divided nation. When he was shot, Secretary Stanton stood by the dead body of the great leader, Lincoln, and said these words, 'Now he belongs to the ages.' And in a real sense, we can say the same thing about Mahatma Gandhi, and even in stronger terms. Now he belongs to the ages. And if this age is to survive, it must follow the way of love and nonviolence that he so nobly illustrated in his life. And Mahatma Gandhi may well be God's appeal to this generation, for in a day when Sputniks and explorers dash through outer space and guided ballistic missiles are carving highways of death through the stratosphere, no nation can win a war. Today, we no longer have a choice between violence and nonviolence. It is either nonviolence or non-existence. King adapted and amplified that work in ways that are suggestive for what must be done to advance a World Health Platform today in the face of an ever more divisive world circumstance and atmosphere. It is important as a matter of historical record to also note that it was the worldwide reaction to the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020 and a need to, in the face of the violence that was characteristic of some of the protests, reassert the higher hypothesis of nonviolent solutions to apparently insoluble problems, as King had successfully done, that the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites was initially formed. A World Health Platform seemed the obvious path to take for such a worldwide resurrection of the application of King's and Gandhi's approach. In his speech called Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution, given at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., 5 days before his assassination, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King told the congregation not a Bible story, but another famous American fable. He said, "I am sure that most of you have read that arresting little story from the pen of Washington Irving entitled Rip Van Winkle. When Rip Van Winkle went up into the mountain, the sign had a picture of King George III of England. When he came down 20 years later, the sign had a picture of George Washington, the first president of the United States. And this reveals to us that the most striking thing about the story of Rip Van Winkle is not merely that Rip slept 20 years, but that he slept through a revolution. To sustain such attention to change the world, we require the quality of what scientist, biochemist, biologist, and inventor Louis Pasteur called enthusiasm, a Greek word meaning the inner God. In a speech before the French Assembly in 1872, Pasteur, the man who would establish the famous Pasteur Brigades, which would eradicate diseases in whole countries, said, "Happy is the man who carries within him an inner God, an ideal of beauty, and who obeys it, an ideal of art, ideal of science, ideal of the fatherland, ideal of humanity, ideal of the virtues of the gospel. Therein lies the living sources of great thoughts and great actions. All are illuminated by the reflections of the infinite. The idea of the infinite potential in the finite moment, of immortality as a practical force in history, of eternal ideas as more powerful than arbitrary momentary force, unifies Pasteur, Gandhi, and King. The particulars of the health system that has to be urgently created today worldwide are important, but the desire to heal the people and their lands worldwide is primary. As Dr. King said, one day we will have to stand before the God of history and we will talk in terms of things we've done. Yes, we will be able to say we built gargantuan bridges to span the seas. We built gigantic buildings to kiss the skies. But it seems that I can hear the God of history saying, that was not enough. But I was hungry and ye fed me not. I was naked and ye clothed me not. I was devoid of a decent sanitary house to live in, and ye provided no shelter for me, and consequently you cannot enter the kingdom of greatness. If ye do it unto the least of these, my brethren, ye do it unto me. That's the question facing America today. And indeed, that is the question facing the world today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. We will next turn to a continued discussion on Operation Ibn Sina, in particular, led by its originator, one of its originators, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, who will be followed by engineer Daud Azimi from Afghanistan, a board member of the Peace National Front of Afghanistan. So, Helga Zepp-LaRouche.
Well, let me just briefly make some remarks about Operation Ibn Sina. The way this came about is that when NATO left Afghanistan in a hurry in August of last year, everybody knew that 80% of the budget of Afghanistan had come from so-called donor countries through aid. And naturally, when the Taliban took over, that aid was immediately cut. So, what was destroyed in a stroke of a pen was the almost entire financial means. The central bank was closing, no money in the banks. People could not even send money into Afghanistan. And naturally, when you do that, the country plunged into a complete chaos. It was in a poor condition before. It turned out that there was, in 20 years of NATO warfighting, nothing built up in terms of the economy. Maybe some schools and some roads were built, but not a functioning economy. Then on top of it, the US and European central banks froze, this is a nice way of putting it, froze $9 billion belonging to the Afghan people. So that money was, stolen, sort of. And naturally, the situation became very rapidly, dramatically worse. And in a few weeks, it became clear that 23 million people were in danger of not making it through the winter, of starving to death. 98% of the entire Afghan population had not enough to eat, was food insecure. I think 7 million children altogether were in life danger. Nobody knows how many of those have died in the meantime. So it was an absolute catastrophe. And, have you heard anything about that in the media? Compare the coverage about Ukraine, as horrible the situation there is. Compare that to the coverage about Afghanistan, where basically more than 50% of the people were, and still many of those are, in mortal danger. So at that point, I called for Operation Ibn Sina. The idea of it was to first try to alarm the world population that there must be an immediate humanitarian aid. In the meantime, many international organizations are there. But that, more importantly, you had to build up the economy, to build infrastructure, to build agriculture, industry, to stop the poppy opium production. And, in the meantime, a lot has been done. The Taliban, not to our surprise, but to the surprise of many, banned all poppy production, banning opium production. But, obviously the country is still in utter need. So I called for Operation Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina is one of the great physicians of all of mankind. He wrote first of all, he lived from 980 to 1037, about 1,000 years ago. He was one of the absolute great physicians of all of mankind. He wrote a canon of medicine, which was the standard medical book even in Europe until the 17th, 18th century. Then he was also he discovered the importance of quarantine to fight epidemics, which obviously was extremely important in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And, so I called the effort to save Afghanistan Operation Ibn Sina. First of all, his father comes from Balkh, that's in northern Afghanistan. He himself is born in Afshana, which is today Uzbekistan, but he is a great hero and a great inspiration for the entire region, but especially for Afghanistan. And I said, in a pandemic, you have to build a modern health system, and the health system, modern hospitals and so forth, can only be built if you have clean water, enough electricity, other basic infrastructure. So I'm still fighting for this idea. In the meantime, I should also say that Ibn Sina was also a great philosopher. He discovered extremely important conceptions, like he made a proof about the immortality of the soul. I can only inspire you to study that because it is an important idea. He discussed the question about the eternity of the universe. This is also extremely important because, did the universe start with a Big Bang, or was there something before? In other words, he formulated scientific questions which are still extremely relevant today. The James Webb telescope will soon give some answers to this question. He also was very famous in Europe. He influenced the European philosophy, Thomas of Aquinas, Dante, Cusa, Marsilio Ficino, and many others. And he was always regarded as one of the towering giants of human history, of universal history. And I thought to give the effort to save Afghanistan the name of such a great physician and philosopher was also important, because when a country is going through hell, and Afghanistan has been going through hell, you need an aspiration connecting with the greatest tradition of the past, but also with the idea of a hope for a much, much better future. And this region of the world was once known as the land of the thousand cities. And hopefully, when the reconstruction of Afghanistan occurs now, which there are some hopeful signs that it will happen in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, that you also need a vision, some optimistic idea about a better humanity. And Ibn Sina is exactly the best possible image, especially because of this dual character of medicine and philosophy. So in the meantime, some positive developments have happened, unfortunately not from the West, not from the United States, not from Europe. All the countries who were there with NATO for 20 years did essentially do very, very little, if at all. But in the meantime, there were two important conferences. One was the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation Conference in Islamabad, and they created a humanitarian fund for the development of Afghanistan. And a few weeks ago, there was another conference in Anhui. This is a province, a very beautiful province of China, where the neighbor countries met together with Wang Yi and others to discuss a regional development perspective for Afghanistan. So there is some hope that things are moving. But very much the situation is still absolutely traumatic, and we should not fool ourselves about that. And I just wanted to tell you about Operation Ibn Sina because, while it is very difficult to win support for it, I have not given up, and I have some collaborators who also have not given up, that this is something which must be put on the agenda for the better future of the Afghan people. And I just wanted to give these short introductory remarks to Daud Azimi, who will tell you some more about it.
Economic and political imperatives.
Good day, Salam Alaikum. Greetings from the Afghan National Peace Front to the Schiller Institute and to the participants of the conference. I hereby convey to you the message and the request from the Leadership Council of the Afghan National Peace Front. The Schiller Institute has convened this conference at a very opportune time, because on the one hand, the global situation has changed, and on the other hand, developments in Afghanistan have great impact on our region and the world. Ladies and gentlemen, the current world is a hotbed of conflicts that cannot be ignored. Some have resorted to violence, and others have tried to resolve them through peace and diplomacy. There is a need for a new global practical theory based on common aspirations to create a global platform for peaceful cooperation. It is good that the Schiller Institute organized this conference, because as a political organization working on the issues, PNF is also working tirelessly for the peace of Afghanistan, and we have established a larger network in the United States, Europe, and Afghanistan. We have also written useful scientific research materials and held various conferences in the USA, Frankfurt am Main, Kabul, and submitted our proposals to the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan through our members Professor Abdul Sattar Sirat and Mr. Sargun Shah Shinwari. Dear participants, we would like to draw your attention to two themes of this conference. First, today's Afghanistan and its new geographical and political situation. Second, the urgent economic and political needs of Afghanistan today. Afghanistan has become a battleground of regional rivalry under the withdrawal of NATO forces. The war in Afghanistan has paved the way for foreign rivalries in Afghanistan's multi-ethnic traditional religious community. Ethnic, religious, and xenophobic conflicts have left the country torn and covered in blood. Afghanistan is described by some as a haven for terrorists. There is a clash of foreign conflicts and the lack of an appropriate practical common policy to protect them from the conflict. Under no circumstances should the experience of bloodshed be repeated. Conferences like this one should focus on the changed political situation of Afghanistan and work on the policy of peace and friendship instead of war and competition. On this complex issue, the Afghan National Peace Front of Afghanistan is working to maintain neutrality and consolidate peace. This conflict has brought people to the brink of hunger and malnutrition. It is true that some international charities are helping these people. These donations are useful, but not enough. Sustainable projects need to be supported. If the Schiller Institute or any prestigious international organization wants to hold a big conference to support the recovery of Afghanistan, the National Front of Afghanistan can help the process with useful experience and ideas from economic experts. The first great political need of the Afghan people is the formation of a government in Afghanistan that corresponds to their forced geographical location, multi-ethnic structure, national characteristics, religious and cultural values, and to preserve national independence and neutrality. I am personally of the opinion that the current political and economic situation in Afghanistan should be further supported in order to achieve a long-term peace. Finally, I would like to thank the Schiller Institute for making it possible for us to participate in this conference and hope for further cooperation in the future. Sincerely, the Central Council of the Afghan National Peace Front.
And thank you for your participation. We'll now turn to our last speaker on this panel before going into the discussion period, which, as in our previous panels, you can join by sending your questions into questions@schillerinstitute.org. Our last speaker before that discussion period is Princey Mtombeni. She hails from South Africa, where she is a communications specialist and the founder of Africa for Nuclear. Her topic, energy security for Africa.
Ladies and gentlemen, greetings to you all. My name is Princey Mtombeni, and I'm coming to you live from a beautiful country called South Africa. I am a nuclear communications specialist and a founder of Africa for Nuclear, an advocacy campaign that promotes nuclear as a key contributor to achieving the African Union Agenda 2063, which is a blueprint and master plan to transform Africa into a global powerhouse of the future. Firstly, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the Schiller Institute Africa Desk for inviting me to deliver this talk. It really is an honor. And just before I start with my presentation, I'd like to share a quote by South Africa's first democratically elected president, Tata Nelson Mandela. He said, and I quote, "Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural, it is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the action of human beings. As long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality exist in our world, none of us can truly rest." Close quote. Ladies and gentlemen, today my talk is titled Nuclear Technology for Africa's Agenda for Sustainable Development. I was born in one of the villages in KwaZulu-Natal, which is one of the provinces here in South Africa. The area had no electricity, so we used things such as paraffin, burning woods, charcoal, candles, and even cow dung to address our energy needs, such as cooking and heating our houses in winter. At the age of 9, I traveled 3 kilometers to get clean water, waking up at 4 a.m. as we had to get water from the fountain while it's still dark outside. I did my primary school years in the same village, where I traveled 4 kilometers to get to school crossing the river. I was forced to do homework just before the sunset because at home we had limited candles. Why I'm sharing this story with you is so that you get to understand the life of a typical African. Even though for many of us in South Africa, the situation has changed, but for many Africans, it still remains unchanged. Energy poverty is still very high in all 55 African countries, with an estimation of over 640 million people in Africa who still have no access to electricity and therefore live in the dark. And that's according to African Development Bank. I'm talking about the continent that is home to almost 1/5 of the world's population, but accounts for less than 4% of global electricity use. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to give you a simple scenario in terms of the reality that some Africans face. A kettle boiled twice a day by a family in Britain uses 5 times as much electricity as a person in Mali uses per year. An Ethiopian takes 87 times longer to consume 150 kilowatt hour of electricity than someone in the United Kingdom. A Tanzanian takes 8 years to consume as much electricity as an American consumes in 1 month. A freezer in the United States consumes 10 times more electricity than a Liberian uses in 1 year. And this is really the true reality of Africa. So access to energy is crucial, and not only for the health and education improvement, but also for unlocking economic potential of Africa and therefore lifting many people out of poverty. Another field that as Africans, I think we should seriously consider exploring is the field of nuclear medicine. Currently, South Africa is the only country in the continent which has its own means of production of radioisotopes and commercialization of radiopharmaceuticals. All other African countries still import their radiopharmaceuticals from mainly from Europe. So there's inadequacy of nuclear medicine in Africa. And in some countries, patients have to travel considerable distances in order to access care. And therefore, I'd like to see efforts being made by our governments to increase the number of these facilities across the continent in the near future. And this would enable citizens to benefit more readily from this very important diagnostic and therapeutic modality of care. Now, I'd like to take you through the recent nuclear energy developments here in Africa, starting with Ghana, which has issued a request for information to assess the nuclear power plant technologies available on the market, which happened in June last year, which saw 15 vendors from China, France, Canada, Korea, Russia, USA, etc., responding to the RFI. Recently, it was reported that Kenya has chosen 2 sites that are best suited for their nuclear build program. The government of Nigeria approved and passed into law 5 nuclear regulations. And recently, they've opened a bid for the construction of a 4-gigawatt nuclear power plant. South Africa has affirmed its plans for a new 2,500 megawatt nuclear power plant with an intention to end the procurement process by 2024. Radiation Protection Authority announced in October last year that it is ready to regulate the use of nuclear technology in Zambia. Rwanda is planning to sign the contract for the feasibility studies in the near term. And lastly, Niger confirmed that it is resolutely committed to carrying out a nuclear power program included in all its political development programs, which is a step in the right direction. Now, what are key things that I'd like us to take into consideration today? Recently, I attended the Nuclear Technology Imbizo, which was organized by the Nuclear Industry Association of South Africa in collaboration with Women in Nuclear South Africa and South African Young Nuclear Professional Society, which took place here in Cape Town in South Africa. And the theme for this event was promoting global partnership to support South Africa's nuclear build program. And the event was attended by the government officials, nuclear industry experts, both national and international, and the Deputy Minister in the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy here in South Africa gave a keynote address. And in her talk, the Deputy Minister highlighted the need to harness all communication platforms at our disposal to inspire and energize South Africans and assert a narrative of hope that nuclear energy can be used to improve our socio-economic lives rather than hopelessness. And I think this should apply to all African nations because indeed the socio-economic challenges that are facing the continent dictate that we should pursue an electricity mix that include nuclear. Countries like Mozambique have gas, which is really positive from carbon budget perspective. However, it is not fully harnessed, and also it will require some countries to develop infrastructure, which is currently not sufficiently developed in order to deliver gas via pipeline resources to power plants in countries that do not have gas. In South Africa, more than 10 to 24 gigawatts of energy capacity is expected to be decommissioned post-2030. And this is mainly due to aging coal power plants, which is a concern for the country, as this will mean that these will have to be replaced with another baseload power source. In a country where water scarcity is a major challenge, this makes the option of hydropower almost impossible, and that leaves the country with nuclear power as one of the options. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really interesting to see many African nations recognizing nuclear power as a key player to achieving Africa's agenda for sustainable development, because in all honesty, one cannot talk about sustainable development or even civilization while millions of people are still living in poverty and are still without access to electricity and clean water. Therefore, nuclear is well positioned to help address these challenges. Now, I think that it's important to highlight Africa's capability in terms of nuclear technology advancement. I've heard many people saying nuclear projects take forever to finish, which make them unattractive for investors. And they usually base these analyses on lack of skills, especially in the African continent. Now, if you look at how the United Arab Emirates, a new Baraka nuclear power plant, this is a nation with no prior nuclear experience, no prior licensing experience, no siting experience, and absolutely no operation of nuclear infrastructure before. The plant's construction started in July 2012 and was completed in December 2018. It took only 78 months for a country with no nuclear experience, which is really, really amazing. And now in the case of Africa, South Africa has majority of, if not all of the above, and they have operated the nuclear research reactor Safari 1 for over 50 years. And this has placed the country among top producers of nuclear medicine worldwide. Also, Koeberg Power Plant has been operating since 1984, and this gives the country and the continent a competitive advantage in terms of capabilities. The world is talking net zero carbon emission by 2050, and that's according to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal. What is concerning is that many developed nations have placed the burden of addressing pollution challenges to African states, and these nations are persuading our leaders to phase out fossil fuels, especially coal, in our countries, and yet they have not done so in their own countries. And what is even worse is them dictating on the type of renewable energy sources that we should implement, and they do that through funding terms and conditions, and they usually recommended sources are wind and solar. I have absolutely no problem with wind and solar. However, these technologies alone will not solve Africa's problem of lack of infrastructure and development. And while I'm also of the view that the issues of climate change need to be addressed, but not at the expense of the poor Africans. It is unfair to put restrictions on the energy choices of poor countries who are continuously trapped in a state of poverty, socioeconomic challenges, and underdevelopment. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, I would like to state that the time will come when Africa will use a lot more energy. In the meantime, especially in South Africa, coal is our current, while nuclear is the future. And therefore, I'd like to call upon the world to help us build nuclear power plants, which are essential for energy security and economic benefits, as well as addressing issues of climate change. Africa is simply tired of being in the dark. And I think it is time for our leaders to take decisive actions and turn around this narrative to power up Africa and accelerate the pace of economic transformation and drive much needed industrialization to create jobs. African Union Agenda 2063 is about transforming Africa into the global powerhouse of the future. And therefore, without solving the energy deficit, neither economic growth nor sustainable development and improvement of citizens' welfare will be possible. And I believe that the effective way to solve the energy shortage, which will be introduction of nuclear power plants in many parts of Africa. And that is the only way that this continent will meet its aspiration of a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development, the Africa that we want. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. And once again, it's been an absolute honor to give this address. I wish you a great day.
And thank you very much for your presentation. Very thoughtful. We will now turn to our discussion period. So we will bring up the panelists, and I will remind our viewers that if you would like to pose a question, you can send them in to questions@schillerinstitute.org. Let's start with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Oh, I should also mention, Daud Azimi was unable to join us, but in his place is another member of the Peace National Front of Afghanistan, Mirvais Popal. Welcome. So, Helga, let's turn to you first if you have any reflections on this panel as a whole, and then we'll turn to some of the questions that have come in.
Well, I'm very inspired by the last presentation by Prinzi because, I fully agree that, that Xi Jinping, when he was, I think it was a BRICS conference some years ago in South Africa, and then he said that the future of Africa is the most brightest because the average age of the people there is very, very young. And by the year 2050, Africa will have 2.5 billion people. So if we now move in the direction, as Prinzi was saying, and all these young people will get a good education, and then we have to create many, many millions of jobs, hundreds of millions of new productive jobs. I think that, and I don't want to say this in any way negative to China, but I think Africa has the potential to be the new China with African characteristics. So I'm very encouraged to what she said, because I do think that if if some of the so-called Western countries are losing somehow the fiber, and sometimes I think they do that, well, then let's take the torch of development elsewhere, and then maybe Africa and Asia, in the spirit of Bandung, will be the barriers of a future hope for all of mankind, including Europe and the United States.
Thank you very much. So let me do this. I'm going to pose a few questions, and then we can go around and see what responses people have. Let me start with a couple that come in on the question of the World Health System. One is, this comes in from Norway. The questioner says that every human being on our planet is entitled, from the time they take their first breath until their last, to good food, proper clothing, proper housing, medical care, and basic education. These needs we all share, no matter our race, nationality, etc. How can we secure these rights for everyone on the planet to eradicate poverty and give every person the liberty to pursue their own happiness, which is the real reason that we exist? So I will turn that. Actually, let me ask Dennis if he'd like to comment on that first. Would you like to respond, Dennis?
I'll just say the following. You can hear me correctly. Franklin Roosevelt gave a speech called The Four Freedoms. And in that speech, he talked about freedom from want. He gave this speech because he wanted to correct what he knew was already a problem. This was during the course of the war. And of course, that war would take, depending on who you listen to, between 60 million and 100 million people, depending on how you count it. 27 million people in the Soviet Union alone. But he recognized that the war was actually caused by the imperial systems that had existed, whether we're talking about Portugal, France, Britain, and he wanted to eliminate this. This was, of course, a big source of his fight with Churchill. Well, he didn't live to do that. But this idea of freedom from want as a central component of what he called the four freedoms is the last of the freedoms to be ever invoked or brought up whenever you're hearing about any of these conferences about human rights. The United States, Britain, various other countries love to do conferences about human rights, but they never talk about the four freedoms. and the notion of freedom from want as being, as Roosevelt had defined it, essential to preventing the outbreak of another world war. So I would submit that I agree, first of all, with what the premise is that the questioner puts forward, but I would also submit that it was precisely the rejection of Roosevelt's idea about what the post-World War world was going to be, and the triumph, unfortunately, at least temporarily, of the British and other imperial views, including the co-optation of the United States against that outlook. And I think that what we have to do is to fight to overturn that unfortunate turn of events.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Mirvais Popal to get your thoughts on how it will be possible to create development in the world so that every person has the requirements for a life that they deserve. And in particular, if you have anything to add on the issue of healthcare in particular, or of Afghanistan's situation in that, please go right ahead.
Ja, hallo. Guten Abend.
Hello, good evening.
Ja, es ist am Beispiel Afghanistan, muss ich sagen, diese Notwendigkeit ist so dermaßen enorm, dass die Menschen fliehen müssen, und die neuen Kriege, die dort vielleicht entstehen könnten, werden gerade kreiert.
In the case of Afghanistan, this is so acute that people have to flee.
Mitbekommen, Afghanistan befindet sich in einem militärischen Konflikt gerade mit Pakistan, wo ein pakistanischer Hubschrauber beschossen worden ist, General verletzt worden ist, und die Situation eskaliert, und das ist Situation ist nicht schön, was gerade ist, und wir wissen nicht, wie sich dann die Situation entwickelt, und ja, die Notwendigkeit der Ressourcen, und die natürlich immer knapper werden, und die dazu führen, dass die Menschen sich auf den Weg machen, um ein besseres Leben haben zu wollen und zu flüchten. Und die Situation kennen wir, was sie auf dem Weg dahin erleben, und ja, und die Situation der Flüchtlinge in Afghanistan.
Lassen Sie mich kurz übersetzen. So we have this continuing warlike situation in Afghanistan, which is forcing people to flee from this situation. And you've all seen the pictures of refugees coming into Europe, and this shows very much the necessity to do something about it.
Ja, und leider ist es so, dass die Weltgemeinschaft, die Afghanen, wie am Anfang erwähnt wurde, einfach ihr Schicksal selbst überlassen hat, und es wird überhaupt nicht getan. Also das ist von den Geldern gesprochen wurde, die Gelder, die halt festgesetzt worden sind und teilweise auch schon in der Planung sind, das für die Opfer des 11. September zu verteilen. Und es kommen monatlich 34 Millionen Dollar nach Afghanistan, was natürlich überhaupt nicht ausreicht, um einen Staat am Leben zu erhalten. Und die also Maßnahmen um Infrastruktur und die Situation für die Menschen, für die Zukunft, und die Menschen die Möglichkeit geben, ihre Zukunft selber in die Hand zu nehmen, werden überhaupt nicht eingeleitet. Und
obwohl diese Lage bekannt ist, tut die internationale Gemeinschaft praktisch nichts. The international, despite the fact that this situation is known, the international community has done nearly nothing. They have even frozen Afghanistan funds and half of that money is supposed to be going to the victims of the 9/11. And at this time, only 34 million per month dollars per month being used to support aid for Afghanistan, and that is really a drop in the bucket. It's really nothing, and it has to be changed.
Thanks.
Thank you. Let's turn next to Prince Simtombene. There's a couple of questions that have come in on energy policy, on nuclear in particular. One of them is about big monetary institutions like BlackRock and others that are making an effort to use finance and environmental sustainability and governance goals to prevent the construction of fossil fuel plants to support green energy, but from this is usually excluded nuclear power. Do you believe that there is an effort to prevent well, you addressed many of these in your presentation, many of the claims that are used to say nuclear power is inappropriate, especially for African countries. Do you have anything to say to the efforts to prevent nuclear from being developed in the world?
Thank you so much. Yes, I have a lot to say when it comes to that, because really, if the world is serious about mitigating climate change, and therefore they would not be selective in the technologies that are available and are suited for that, to achieve that. And therefore, really, it makes me question the agenda in this whole climate change thing, to say, is it really honest? Are we really having honest and scientific discussions when it comes to mitigating climate change? Or it's really one of those global agendas of dominance? So yeah, that's just my take to it, to say, if you want a clean air, or if you want a world where climate change is mitigated, therefore you would include nuclear as part of the energy mix, and especially if really the development or our economies matter, because at the end of the day, what I have seen happening is that we sort of have people who are more focused on mitigating climate change while they are neglecting developmental issues, which I find as hypocrisy. And that's just my take in it. And then I also saw a comment about African leaders being corrupt. It's on the chart. So I just want to also touch on that, to say corruption does not come dressed in race. Anyone can be corrupt anywhere else in the world. And secondly, the commentary says, so African government cannot handle nuclear. We have nuclear power plants in South Africa. We have been involved in nuclear developments in Africa since 1965. And South Africa is also an African country. Egypt is about to build the nuclear power plant. So therefore, if these countries are able to handle nuclear power plants, any country anywhere else in Africa can be able to also achieve that. And lastly, government officials do not manage nuclear power plants. There are processes that actually have that the governments have to undergo in order for the International Atomic Energy to actually assess the readiness of the country in terms of building or nuclear infrastructure, which really you don't just, when you get assessed, you don't just get a license handed over to you. So it's not government officials handling nuclear power plants, but scientists and engineers under the guidance of regulatory authorities, including the International Atomic Energy Agency. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, Dr. Koo addressed this issue of corruption a bit in panel number 2, but I think one of the things it brings up is about people talk about corruption, they often mean administrative corruption. But you think about the amount of corruption of intent that exists. The institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, NATO? You know, what is the intent of these institutions? What about corruption at that level? Let me actually ask a question that's on that and pose it to whoever would like to take it. Comes from Etienne in France. He said, I'm watching the conference and I'm surprised that in a discussion about putting humanity on a path towards progress, today at the conference, we have not spoken more about a real enemy who is sabotaging economies, every country, even pushing a new world war. By this, I mean the Malthusian and eugenics-oriented oligarchy, historically pivoted around the British monarchy and pushing depopulation today through climate goals, global war, economic catastrophe. Can we be rid of them and be happy to build a multipolar world? Would anyone like to take on this thought from Etienne?
Well, I can say something about it. The whole idea of the World Health Platform that Helga Zepp-LaRouche put forward at the time she put it forward was often misunderstood by people. It was a very important, rather brilliant, actually, flank against the Malthusians. By the way, the Malthusians also run the climate change process. I mean, you're talking about the fact that their fundamental opposition is to the development, growth, and prosperity, particularly of Black Africa. And that is not any exaggeration at all. That's something that was expressed and has been expressed over the course of the past 100 years by many, whether we're talking about Lothrop Stoddard of the United States, who wrote the book, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, and who was the originator, by the way, of the term Untermensch, as an Untermenschen. That did not originate in Germany, that originated in the United States. So whether we're talking about people like that, or we're talking about Winston Churchill, the famous great patriot, race patriot, by the way, called Winston Churchill, that's been the case for a long time. Now, the problem is, and often it's been, that many have become angry about that, and many in different parts of the world, Black, brown, yellow, so forth, have been angry about this. But there's something different in what China has done, and there's something different in what was just proposed, what we just heard. And it's interesting that in the course of the discussion, this business about African corruption comes up, and then people say, well, Africa can't handle nuclear power. I'd like to call attention to one individual by the name of Cheikh Anta Diop, who was a physicist from Senegal. He ran the radiocarbon laboratory in the University of Senegal at Dakar. And faced with this sort of unspoken and spoken racism, what he did was he took the theory of relativity of Einstein and he translated it into Wolof. And he did this because his argument was he wanted to demonstrate that it was possible for a profound set of ideas to be translated into an African language, and that in fact, Africa need not speak English or French or Spanish as a primary language, including in scientific affairs. He also was a fierce proponent of advanced technologies and nuclear power in particular, including thermonuclear fusion. And in his book, Black Africa, the Economic and Cultural Basis for a Federated State, he explicitly described thermonuclear fusion and the fact that if that were achieved as a result of development of nuclear fission, that you could have a situation where power could be generated for literally thousands of years. It's these kinds of ideas which are hated by various of these oligarchies, including people like Prince Charles and others who talk about a great reset or talk about the idea of putting the world on warlike footing to reduce the, quote, carbon footprint. Well, I know a lot of these people think that carbon is dirty and black, and they think that that black footprint should be reduced. I happen to believe that the world is a lot better than that. I think that what we've heard and seen coming from China in particular, I think what we've heard, and also the fact matter coming from Russia and other countries, and their commitment to a forward approach means that we can defeat the Malthusian disease. And I think that the importance of what was done with the World Health Platform, as Helga first put it forward, was it was a brilliant attempt to bring that into play in a way which does not threaten people. It's nonviolent, it's creative, and it's direct, and it's necessary.
Great, thank you.
Well, let me just add to that. I mean, if you look at the way how the refugee question is being discussed right now in Europe, there was a wide reception, open arms for the Ukrainian refugees. This was by countries like Poland, who only a few weeks ago had, in the most brutal way, turned back refugees coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. And then some Western politicians said, "Oh, the Ukrainians are so much like us," meaning white. I think that there is, a non-expressed underlying racism, Malthusianism, racism, which basically comes down to the same thing sometimes, where, why is it that the Afghan crisis is not being discussed? I mean, this was stated by, I think it was Beasley from the World Food Program, who said that the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan was the biggest one on the planet. And that takes into account the equally horrible situation in Yemen, the absolute still horrendous situation in Syria and Haiti. We discussed that. So I think that in non-discussing these issues, including emphatically Afghanistan, maybe people don't mind, maybe what other conclusion you should come to, that, they take this into account, and some people think there are too many people anyway. Overpopulation was a famous invention by David Rockefeller III, which I encountered in 1974 at the Bucharest World Population Conference. I mean, there is an underlying idea that there are too many people, and if the four horsemen of the apocalypse take care of that, war, disease, death, and I don't know what the fourth one was, I think war, then so be it. And I think that is why we are doing what we are doing, and why we need to have an international movement of people who, basically express the will and right for development of the majority of the human population. And that happens to be, the countries of Africa, of Asia. And, so it's something we are in the process of changing by, broadening the discussion. And one of the good things is that, we can discuss these things with people from all continents in the same way. So we are breaking through an utmost controlled environment of mainstream media in the Western countries, which is completely in lockstep. And, we heard it earlier, there is a huge censorship. And the only way how to break through that is to broaden the discussion to the whole international community.
Let me do this at this point then. I have a question that is specific to you, Helga. I'd like to pose that to you, and then I'd like to go around and have everybody weigh in with their reflections. So this question to you is asking about Lyndon LaRouche's conception of the Strategic Defense Initiative as an earlier precedent for the idea of the coincidence of the opposites, in the sense of a proposal for the U.S. and the Soviet Union to work together on missile defense. Could you describe how that policy plays a role as an idea today, and also its similarity to the Treaty of Westphalia? And if you'd like, if you could say anything about how it was crushed as a concept at that time.
Well, I mean, the idea was generated by Lynn, by my late husband. We had a magazine, a scientific magazine, which was called Fusion, which had at its high point 150,000 subscriptions, which for a scientific magazine is a lot. And in that capacity, we studied, all kinds of technological developments, including the development of defensive beam weapons, of laser weapons. And all of a sudden, we realized that the main author in Russia stopped publishing. And then we started to investigate it, and we saw that the Soviets at that point were developing a point defense system for Moscow. And, at the same time, you had the middle-level missile crisis, the Pershing 20 and the Pershing 2 and the SS-20 being only a few minutes apart from each other in NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And these systems were permanently on high alert because the warning time was so little that, if one side would have seen one of these nuclear missiles on the screen, it would have led to an automatic launch because otherwise it would have been too late. So the world was living literally under the Damocles sword of a nuclear extinction, very much like now. The only difference was at that time, we had a very powerful peace movement, and many people were extremely aware that, we were on the verge of World War III. For example, Helmut Schmidt, who was the Chancellor of Germany at that time, repeatedly said, we are on the verge of World War III. And he blamed in particular Brzezinski, who one of our contacts told us once Helmut Schmidt kicked out of his office in Hamburg by saying the policies he was pushing were threatening the existence of mankind. So it was a very hot situation. So my husband looked at the situation and said that the biggest danger to world peace comes at the moment when one side is about to develop weapons based on new physical principles which make the nuclear weapons of the other side potentially obsolete. That this could create a situation whereby the one side would be tempted to use these weapons while they still would work. Now, this was a situation which in many ways was extremely dangerous. I would say not as dangerous as now, but very, very dangerous. So my husband developed this idea that the West should cooperate with the Soviet Union in the development of these new weapon systems based on new physical principles. This was a very elaborated scheme whereby 4 systems of such weapons would have been developed. One to basically target the missiles when they were in their boost phase, when they're still relatively slow. Then 2 systems catching the missiles in orbit, and then a 4th system, a point defense system, which basically would have meant it would have been 100% secure, that you catch every missile. And more important, that for the first time, a system was possible which would have been cheaper in the defense than in the offense. So you would have basically outworked the possibility of an aggressive system. Now, this was a revolutionary proposal, and we went around and had conferences in Washington, in Rome, in Paris, in Bonn, because the capital still was in Bonn. And we were in discussion with the entire military of Europe. I remember we had several events in Bonn with people from the defense ministry, with all kinds of generals from France. The French were very skeptical because it would have, immediately recognized that it would have destroyed their system of tout azimut defense. But they were very interested because they saw it was workable. Now, in this context, my husband developed contact with the national security advisor of President Reagan, and they encouraged that we would have back-channel discussions with the Soviets, which we did for 1 full year. And there was a serious discussion. What would it do if the United States and the Soviet Union would together make investments in technologies which make nuclear weapons technologically obsolete? It went back and forth. And then after 1 full year of such back-channel discussions, we got the answer from Moscow, which was no. Why? Because the estimation was that the development of such systems would help the West more than the Soviet Union. So, but that was not the end of it. This was in February 1983, And 1 month later, on the 23rd of March, President Reagan appeared in the American TV and announced something to be the official American security policy, which he called the Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, immediately, all hell broke loose. I mean, we had, some of our experts were called by the TV. They were interviewed. There was a turmoil on both sides in Washington. A certain faction completely went wild. The same happened in Moscow. There were many, many slanders in the Soviet media calling my husband a troglodyte, calling me Teutonia, with pictures associated. In any case, this was not what the media made. The media made out of this Star Wars. They said, this is an effort to militarize space, which it was not. As a matter of fact, it was an absolutely revolutionary proposal. President Reagan had understood the concept, and he even offered to the Soviets that the United States would help the Soviets to apply these new technologies in the civilian economy to boost the productivity of that civilian economy, because that's where the Soviet Union had bottlenecks, which you could see, for example, that 40% of their agriculture would rot because they didn't have the infrastructure. So the idea that you would take a technological leap, which would create a completely different platform, would have actually saved the Soviet Union. But at that point, there were other plans like the Orgakov plan, why this was rejected. But what my husband proposed was an absolutely revolutionary idea, because it was the idea both the West, the United States, but also Europe, would develop together with the Soviet Union these new systems. This would create an absolute jump in the productivity of the economy, and that would then be used to make a joint huge technology transfer to the developing countries. So you would stop to use the developing countries as proxy for proxy countries for proxy war for the superpowers. And at the same time, the proposal included the dissolution of NATO and the Warsaw Pact to overcome the blocs and have instead a peaceful cooperation for the overcoming of the underdevelopment of the developing sector in a joint operation. Now, this was a vision, an absolute vision of overcoming the Cold War, of overcoming the bloc formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And, at least for 8 months, this was officially the policy of President Reagan. Now, this was the same kind of thinking, because the Cold War, you had two military blocs who were basically, the high point of it was naturally the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we came very, very close to an actual nuclear war, which was only the wisdom of John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev, who had a much better understanding than between the United States and Russia today. But it was, it was the thinking that you overcome a seemingly impossible conflict by establishing a higher level of joint development. And that thinking was actually the same idea, or the same principle, which guided when we proposed the Eurasian land bridge, when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, to integrate the Eurasian continent through a development perspective by building corridors which would unite the population and industrial centers of Europe with those of Asia, which, was also sabotaged because some people thought, that the crushing of Russia into a third world raw material country was better than allowing the development of the Eurasian continent. But the same idea was later implemented by China with the Belt and Road Initiative. So it is absolutely moving forward. And naturally, what we are proposing today with an international security architecture is the same idea that peace can only occur through development, and that you create something which is in the benefit of all, and therefore you create a higher level of cooperation than would exist on the level where the conflicts appear. So it's all really one tradition. And, you know, the IDB, which I mentioned earlier, the international development idea of my husband from 75, had the same basic concept. So in a way, if you study the work of our movement for the last 50 years, it has been absolutely consistent. Sometimes the tactic changed because of the changed circumstances, but our commitment was all the time the same, that we absolutely have to overcome the underdevelopment of the developing countries as the absolute basis for peace of the entire world.
Okay. Thank you, Helga. So let's now move on to concluding statements from everybody. Let's start with, I know it's quite, actually, I guess it's similar time zone in Germany and South Africa, but let's go to Princey next. Let me just pose another couple questions that came in for you, but feel free to just respond in general to whatever thoughts you'd like to share with our audience. So this comes from somebody associated with the University of Lagos and the founder of what seems to be a consulting firm. They ask, what are your thoughts on improving energy access in Nigeria in the absence of cost-reflective tariffs for public power supply services? That's a very specific one. And then also, in overall energy access being a human rights issue, which of the following qualities should guide Africa towards reducing energy poverty? Safety, cleanliness, durability, availability, affordability. What's important in crafting an energy policy?
Thank you so much. I really did not get the whole of the first question because you cut off a little bit there. But yeah, just before you go back to it, I would like to address the second question so that I also don't forget. So I think that all those should be taken into consideration: affordability, environmentally friendly or environmentally acceptable, cost-effective. All those should be taken into consideration. And however, my take is that I will make an example with COVID-19. We've had a pandemic, and because it was a pandemic and people's lives mattered even more than the cost issues, we found ourselves as different governments having to get vaccines, very expensive vaccines in our countries. And to me, the issue of access to energy in Africa has become a pandemic, and it should be treated exactly like that. I don't think people's lives really should not be prioritized or should be compared to there's no value to a human life. That's just my take. And if we are saying that because of affordability, then what are we saying about people who, in the process of us not affording to give them access to electricity, are dying? And really, I grew up, especially in school, having to hear stories that a kid died in their houses because of a candlelight, or because of the charcoal burning. Those are stories that we hear, and somehow they've become normal. And whenever issues of energy access or issues of climate change are discussed, those are things that we tend to ignore, which to me are also important. While the cost effective should be taken into consideration in deciding on the energy choices that the African need, but also, and I always say, if people say nuclear is expensive, why don't we choose our capital wisely? Because if you get nuclear power plant that you are going to operate for even 100 years, then and then as opposed to getting a plant that you consider cheap, but you will only operate for a few years, and the same plant will not be able to give you electricity when you most need it. So it's a matter of choosing the capital cost wisely. So that's just my take. Please repeat the first question for me from the consultant.
Well, it was a little bit specific about Nigeria, and to be honest, I somewhat regret posing such a detailed question as we're trying to wrap up the panel. So your very brief thoughts on it, please. The consultant asked, what are your thoughts on improving energy access in Nigeria in the absence of cost-reflective tariffs for public power supply services? And
okay, all right. There's a post on Facebook that I saw today, which was actually reflecting countries, African countries who uses electricity the most, and Nigeria was not there. And Nigeria is the most populated country in Africa. It was really surprising. And because when you look at Nigeria, I have had engagements with their officials who, it was, funny to hear him say, when I asked how many people have access to electricity in Nigeria, he couldn't tell me. And then he was saying, it depends what you mean about access to electricity. I'm like, it doesn't depend on anything. It's like, how many people have access to electricity 24/7? Or, I mean, he said some people may have electricity for a few hours per day. But I've never been to Nigeria. But from what I gathered is that most people really use generators. And those generators, by those who use generators, by the way, are those people who can afford generators because they're expensive. So I really believe that the countries like Nigeria also should prioritize giving access to energy to all people. And it's even good that they do have a natural gas, which I believe that they intend to expand on that. But I'm also happy to hear in the news that they are also taking into consideration building the 4 gigawatt of nuclear power plant, which is really good. And lastly, yes, Nigeria does need an energy mix that include both nuclear and renewables.
thank you very much, and thank you so much for joining our conference today. Let's turn for concluding thoughts to Mirvais Popal. Would you like to offer your reflections as we close out this panel? And please remember, just a few sentences at a time to let the translators interpret consecutively.
Also wenn ich dann jetzt auf dieses Problem Energie und Versorgung kurz eingehen darf. Afghanistan hat, ich rede auf Beispiel Afghanistan, ein sehr großes Problem mit Energiebedarf. Also Afghanistan hat viel großes Energiebedarf, wird alles importiert fast, aber gleichzeitig Afghanistan hat viel Wasser, was auch seinen eigenen Strom auch erzeugen könnte und auch vielleicht an Windräder man aufstellen kann. Aber leider ist in den 20 Jahren, als die Westen dort in Afghanistan waren.
Allow the translator, please.
Yes. Talking about energy needs, obviously, this is one of the major problems for Afghanistan. It has practically no energy sources of its own. All the energy has to be imported, though it does have water, and that water could be harnessed with water power plants. But in the 20 years of occupation, nothing was done to do that. And therefore, the country doesn't have the energy that it needs.
Und es ist natürlich für die weitere Entwicklung wichtig, Energie zu haben oder eigene Energie zu erzeugen. Es sind jetzt viele, auch die Nachbarländer würden gerne in Afghanistan investieren, aber ein großes Problem Afghanistan momentan ist, dass der Afghanistan nicht anerkannt wird. Das ist auch ein weiteres Problem, weil natürlich dieses wirtschaftliche Zusammenarbeit nicht finden kann, weil die Anerkennung ein großes Hindernis ist. Die Zukunft ist offen. Wir wissen, kein Mensch weiß, wie die Situation in Afghanistan sich entwickeln würde.
So it's obvious that for a future development, Afghanistan has to develop its energy production, whether it's water power or renewables or whatever. Another problem is that there are many countries that would like to invest in Afghanistan, but one of the obstacles to that is that the government of Afghanistan is not recognized, and therefore many of these investors they just have no one really to turn to that is recognized internationally as representing Afghanistan, and that is another obstacle that has to be dealt with. So that then we can use these investors and they can come into the country and help build it up.
Es ist derartig absurd, die Situation. Afghanistan befindet sich in einer Situation, wo die Westmächte einen Wert von 85 Milliarden Dollar Waffen dort hinterlassen haben. Und diese Waffen sind in den Händen von den jetzigen Regierung, die Taliban. Und die Taliban sind natürlich auch nicht eine Einheit, sondern hier sind verschiedene Strömungen dort. Und der Einfluss der Islamische Staat wird auch immer größer, weil je schneller dieser Staat, was da entstanden ist, scheitert, umso größer werden ihre Einflussnahmen. Und das könnte dazu führen, dass die gesamte Region destabilisiert wird. Was leider auch erwähnt wurde, dass die Presse über viele Konflikte und Situationen nicht spricht, ist es, dass in Pakistan ein erbitterter Kampf von den pakistanischen Taliban stattfindet, die diesen Staat auch destabilisiert, was auch eine Atommacht ist und mit hunderten Millionen von Einwohnern, was natürlich auch eine Auswirkung auf Afghanistan haben wird.
The situation is completely absurd because the Western powers, when they left the countries, they left military equipment in a value of $85 billion in the hands of the Taliban. And now they don't recognize it. They have created a situation where there is a ungovernability, and that increases the influence of even more radical groups like the Islamic State. And another aspect is that there is in Pakistan there are also Taliban, and they're in a battle, in a war against the Pakistani government. And Pakistan is a nuclear power, and it has 100 million inhabitants. So if that situation is not rectified, then the whole region is threatened to be destabilized even further.
Und was leider auch jetzt sehr offen darüber gesprochen wird, dass es eine Teilung Afghanistan, was auch immer eine Debatte war, und diese Strukturen, die man in vergangenen 20 Jahren also die Machtstrukturen, die man aufgebaut hat, waren so eine ethnische Struktur, die man auch jetzt von den Taliban fordert, führt dazu, dass Afghanistan in 4 verschiedenen Regionen oder 4 verschiedene Ethnien aufgeteilt ist und die alle sich dann einfach Autonomie wollen. Und das wäre eine sehr große Katastrophe für die Region, wenn Afghanistan in 4 verschiedenen Teilen aufgeteilt wird. Das würde dazu führen, dass eine erbitterte innere Kämpfe entstehen würden, weil gerade die Taliban, die auch größten ethnische Gruppe darstellen, das nicht akzeptieren wollen, und die anderen kleineren ethnischen Gruppen auch Unterstützung aus den Nachbarländern und sogar aus USA und in den Westen bekommen und eine Situation herbeiführen, was in den 90er Jahren auch gegeben hat, wo Afghanistan zerstört wurde, wirklich komplett zerstört wurde, bis zu 90%. Wo die Mujahideen aufeinander losgegangen sind. Das ist dann leider die Szenario für die Zukunft Afghanistan.
The problem for the last 20 years was that the Western powers have strengthened or based the administration of Afghanistan, strengthening the different ethnic communities within Afghanistan. And now there's talk about dividing the country up into separate entities for these the four largest of these ethnic entities, and that would create a new civil war like in the 1980s, where the whole country was completely destroyed, because this you have the Taliban as representing the biggest ethnic group. They wouldn't agree to that, and then you have the whole country would be thrown into a war situation.
Thank you. So let's turn next to Dennis.
Yeah, well, a few things come to mind. I happen to have in my bookshelf this book. I understand, even though it looks backwards to me, it looks okay to you guys. Oh, there it is. The Industrialization of Africa. This was done by Helga's Fusion Energy Foundation in 1978. And it's interesting to sort of think over where we are today and what we see in terms of this proposal for a World Health Platform, what it relates to. Helga already referenced her 1974 intervention in Bucharest against the Rockefellers, John Rockefeller and his plans for depopulation. I think she got chased around that conference, if I'm not mistaken, by Margaret Mead, who was carrying a kind of a stick that she was sort of going after Helga with. That same Margaret Mead, a year later, I think, became the head of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So what happened in America was that the Malthusians got control of that. We didn't give up. Against the Malthusian organization, the Club of Rome, Helga founded the Club of Life organization, which explicitly campaigned for the ideas of Pope Paul VI and others, that development was the new name of peace, and the more people that you had, the better, that the human beings are the primary resource that exists in the universe, because we're capable of reinventing ourselves and, in fact, discovering and inventing resources as a whole. The Schiller Institute was founded in 1984, and it was an attempt to try to educate, particularly the American State Department, about the proposals that, for example, Lyndon LaRouche had made, but the basis upon which he was making those proposals. Now, as you can see from the product that is there now, that project didn't work. But in 1985, the following year, I remember that we did a demonstration in Washington, D.C. And for this demonstration, many of the people who still survived from the American Civil Rights Movement joined us for that demonstration. And the theme was, as we called it, we have a dream, feed Africa and build the beam, referring to the laser technologies that were the actual subject of what this beam weapons proposal that Helga went through at great extent there, was all about. It's all about trying to create a revolution in the capabilities of production and of creativity of humanity. And by making a defensive system that was cheaper than the cost of killing one another, it made it impossible that system could not be understood. I think that when you look now at this idea of a World Health Platform, look at the health of the transatlantic sector, compare, for example, what was done in China in the early days of the spread of the coronavirus in particular, or what's going on there now, to the fact that we're looking at an acceptance of millions of people dead, for example, in the United States itself. We're talking about a new normal. What's normal about that? No, that's a new abnormal. And the concept is that we're saying that the billions of people on the planet that require not only to be kept secure against a disease, but require, more importantly, healthcare. They require to be able to have a prosperous long life, because that long life is where you get the greatest value out of not just, quote, the labor force from the standpoint of the number of hours they work. No, it's the knowledge, it's the creativity, it's the development of these capabilities, the development of the capability to undo your own axioms, to learn that you can actually learn how to learn, to learn that the things that you believe at any one moment are subject to being revolutionized, not because you're being brainwashed, but because actually you're discovering something at a profounder level, and you're discovering it from other cultures and other people, and that you don't have to be afraid of the world because you're ignorant of the world. That this concept around the idea of health, mental health, as well as the physical well-being of humanity is what's posed by this idea. Clearly, there's an urgent situation in every respect. Helga mentioned the four horsemen, the war, famine, pestilence, and disease. Some people also include death as one of the four, because pestilence and disease are several things. But the concept is that you have to have a love of humanity, a notion of humanity that sees it as being naturally good, and in fact, the most advanced part of the natural world. Louis Pasteur once said, disseminate laboratories. It is there that humanity becomes greater, stronger, and better. And that's exactly the idea. The great laboratory of the human mind and the great laboratory of our time is, can we manage to pull ourselves together as a single idea, as a single culture, and use the best of humanity in the ways in which it was meant to be done. And so I just want to point out to people that the idea of the World Health Program and the details of it are something we can discuss. They've been in many documents in many different ways. And actually also, it's a very complex thing, which has to be really figured out. So it poses a way that everybody can collaborate, can come to the table, as they say, and especially with all of the differences. We've heard a lot of differences all day today. Some people are upset that we're hearing all these differences. Frankly, it's precisely by hearing the differences and reconsidering what you think you know that we ourselves become better and can improve. And that's the only clear pathway forward. Something that Lyndon LaRouche always taught any of us that met him, that exactly at the point that you believe that you have reached the limits of your knowledge, recognize that that means that you've only begun to learn, and you have to recommit, sort of rebuild everything in the way in which you're thinking, because there's a completely new world outside of you, outside of what you know, and it's better than the one that you've inhabited.
Thank you much. At this point, I'd like to just acknowledge some of the other questions that came in. We're not going to be able to answer them, but I want to just share what kind of things we've been getting in. There was a question about universal basic income. There was a question about the national credit system as opposed to the Wall Street system. There was a question about the Belt and Road Initiative. There was a question about building a Bering Strait connection between Alaska and Siberia. There's a comment that came in from another person from Nigeria saying they are in support of the call for a formation of a Schiller Institute movement. There's a question about how a world healthcare system would be different from something administered by the WHO, which the questioner doesn't hold in high esteem. So that's just a sense of some of the other questions that came in. I think that we're at the conclusion now. So I do want to just say, Princey, if you have like just one other short comment you'd like to make, please take a minute now, if you'd like to, and then we'll turn to Helga for the conclusion of the conference.
Well, in conclusion, I would like to say to the world that Africa is the next global powerhouse of the future, and it is up to the world on whether they want to join or they want to be left behind. And to my nuclear community, I invite you all to come and help us build more nuclear power plants in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. And very good to have you. And we will hear from Helga at Zepp-LaRouche to close out our conference.
Well, I think what we are trying to do is we try to create a world movement of people who, fight against the danger of nuclear war, who fight for a new paradigm. And obviously, when you are trying to, put together a movement all over the world, you cannot expect that you come together sort of for the first time and everybody is in total agreement. And if you agree on the most basic questions, which is that we absolutely cannot have a nuclear war and that we need a new paradigm because the old institutions are failing, then that is a good beginning. And if there are other questions which are not so clear or people have different views, well, that's not a problem because I think we are all in a process of hopefully learning, of self-perfection. Dennis just said, that you can undo your axioms. I think this is very important because, how comes that people react to the same event in so different ways? How does it come that people have different interpretation of the same thing, what they jointly experience? It has to do with the axioms and theorems, because the axioms determine what you think and how you look at a certain thing. And that's why I kept earlier mentioning so much the image of man, because the image of man is one of the most essential axioms, because either you think each human being is potentially limitless perfectible and potentially limitless good. That is one idea. Or you think that just a small group of people should have all the privileges and they should rule over backward people. Well, that's a different axiom. Or you think man is bad, evil from definition, and you need a strong state like a Leviathan to keep that bad person under control. These are all completely different images of man, or the second two are very similar. And therefore, one has to start with those fundamental ideas, axioms. And there again, Friedrich Schiller, and, the Schiller Institute is called Schiller Institute because of the German poet Friedrich Schiller. And one of his most important writings was about why should we study universal history? And I can only emphasize everybody should read that, because it gives you an approach of very much how we think and what we want to accomplish. And he starts that beautiful treatise with the confrontation of what he calls the philosophical mind and the bread-fed scholar. He says the philosophical mind is somebody who loves truth much more than his system, and he is the one who takes apart the system to put it together more perfectly, because he loves truth more than all ideologies and doctrines, as compared to the bread-fed scholar who learns up to a certain point, then he makes his degree in university. But then after that, he does not want to have any more knowledge because, he already has learned, and now he doesn't, want to have the pain of learning new things all the time. And therefore, he becomes the most reactionary because he fends off all new inventions and new knowledge. And, you have very few people, unfortunately, who are such philosophical minds. But that is what counts, because, if you have people who have many opinions and equal, say, my opinion is as good as your opinion, well, then you end up in the kind of cacophonia what we experience today. And that is being manipulated by the media. I mean, there are mass media who have studied how to manipulate the view of people, how to nudge them. That's a book, actually, Nudge, The Nudge. This is by Kai Sunstein, a terrible book, which describes how to manipulate people to cause them to think the opposite of what they were thinking before. So how do you fight in a world which is so complex and so difficult and so many different challenges? How do you deal with that? And I can only say, that in order to make this beautiful human race and there's only one race, by the way, there are not several races, only one human race. How do you make sure that mankind can survive this very difficult situation? I think it depends on a lot of people who take the development of their own mind seriously enough that you become a truth-seeking person. And truth-seeking persons, the only people who normally fit that category are scientists, because you have to test a scientific principle, because if you don't test it, then it's not valid, and you have to go deeper and deeper into the matter. And great artists, we had many friends in the last decades from many fields who were truth-seeking people. Like, I give you one example, Norbert Breinin, who was the first violinist of the Amadeus Quartet, who was a very close friend of my husband, and I also we liked each other a lot. But he described how the Amadeus Quartet was actually accomplishing the great art which they could perform. He said they took the late Beethoven quartets and they would rehearse them over and over until they were certain that they had an approximation of what Beethoven, the composer, had intended to do. And that is what I call truth-seeking. So if you are a truth-seeking person, then you may not be perfect and you may not know everything at once and not even, at the end of your life, but you have developed a method of honesty in trying to get to the truth. And right now, I think the more people really work from the things which we absolutely can know as certain, and that is that we have to save this beautiful human species, and that we have to have an image of man which is optimistic, which takes man as limitless perfectible, and that identity of a limitless perfectible human mind is in cohesion with the laws of the physical universe. There is a simple proof of that, which is the fact that the human mind can generate a valid idea. And if that valid idea is, applied and, leads to a deeper discovery of a physical principle of the universe, then that is called scientific progress. And, that is then, if it is applied in the production process in the form of a technology, then that leads to an increase of the productivity and the increase of the living standard, the longevity. And, if you look at the evolution, and Caleb was talking about it very nice earlier in the panel, if you take that from the standpoint of the evolution of the last, let's say, 10,000 years, you see an enormous progress, what human creativity has accomplished. Now, that proves that an immaterial idea, something which is being created by the mind, which has no weight, an idea has no length, it doesn't have any matter, but it can change the physical universe. And that means that there must be a cohesion between the mental creativity and the lawfulness of the universe, because otherwise we would still do the same thing like the beavers and the rabbits and all the other beautiful animals which we also like, but they can't do what human beings can do. And because there is such a cohesion between human creativity and the laws of the universe, you have something to work with to become a truth-seeking person. And I think that that is a quality which is absolutely required if we want to win this very crucial battle.
Thank you very much. So thank you to our panelists, Princium Tombene, Marvais Popol, Dennis Speed, of course, Schiller Institute founder Helga Zepp-LaRouche. And this is the concluding panel of our conference, and that will wrap up our conference on a new security and development architecture for all nations of the planet. Let me ask you to offer your support to the Schiller Institute. If you have not already signed up with us to make sure you're in touch, getting our emails, please do so, schillerinstitute.com. And we need your money. So go to the donate section of the webpage and become a recurring member. Make a monthly contribution to the Schiller Institute so that we can bring this new paradigm into being. Thank you in advance for your support, and that will conclude our conference.